The continent existed long before humans ever set foot upon its soil, long before the first monster crawled from dimensional rifts, long before chaos magic saturated the air with unseen energies waiting to be harnessed by those willing to pay its price. In those ancient times, the landscape stretched vast and untamed, dominated by civilizations whose names have faded into scholarly texts and fragmented oral traditions. The world belonged to races who would later be called the Elder Races, though they would never have named themselves such, for they knew no successors, no inheritors who might one day reduce them to historical footnotes and museum curiosities. Before we dive further into the cataclysmic event known as the conjunction of the spheres, I would be honored if you'd like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you're truly passionate about exploring the deeper lore of the Witcher universe with us. I would also love to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Let us know in the comments. The gnomes were among the first, if not the very first, to carve their settlements into stone and earth. They built their halls deep within mountain ranges that would later bear different names under different kingdoms, establishing communities that thrived on craftsmanship, mining, and a particular understanding of minerals and metals that few would ever replicate. Alongside them came the dwarfs, stocky and enduring, whose own mastery of smithing and stonework created cities that would outlast their builders by centuries. These were not primitive peoples scratching survival from hostile terrain. They possessed sophisticated social structures, intricate belief systems, and technological achievements that demonstrated generations of accumulated knowledge. The halflings, too, walked the continent in those days, smaller in stature and preferring agricultural pursuits to the underground labyrinths favored by gnomes and dwarfs, establishing farming communities in fertile river valleys and establishing trade networks that connected disparate settlements across vast distances. The world these elder races inhabited differed fundamentally from what would come after. Magic existed, certainly, though not in the form that would later define the age of sorcerers and sorceresses. The ambient chaos energy that practitioners would eventually learn to channel and manipulate remained locked away in other dimensions, inaccessible to this particular sphere of reality. What magic existed belonged to specific beings, intrinsic to their nature rather than learned through study and sacrifice. The land itself held no monsters, no necrophages lurking in cemeteries, no draconids nesting in mountain caves, no cursed ones prowling forest paths under full moons. The dangers that existed came from natural predators, territorial disputes, harsh weather, and the ordinary perils of existence in a world not yet transformed by cosmic catastrophe. The elder races established their own hierarchies, their own conflicts, their own moments of cooperation and betrayal. Dwarven holds traded with gnomish workshops. Halfling farmers provided grain and livestock to communities less suited for agriculture. Territorial boundaries shifted through negotiation and occasionally through force. These civilizations developed religious beliefs that reflected their understanding of the world, worshipping deities tied to earth, stone, harvest, and the turning of seasons. They created art that expressed their values and recorded their histories in forms both written and oral, passing knowledge from generation to generation with the assumption that their descendants would inherit a world fundamentally similar to the one they inhabited. Then came the elves, though their arrival predates the conjunction of the spheres itself, marking them as distinct from the later invasions of humans and monsters. The Een Shade, as they called themselves, possessed abilities that the existing inhabitants of the continent could scarcely comprehend. These newcomers traveled between worlds, navigating dimensional boundaries through means that seemed as natural to them as walking through a forest. They did not arrive through violent rifts or cataclysmic tears in reality's fabric. Rather, they simply appeared, having chosen this particular sphere as their destination through deliberate intent rather than desperate accident. The elves brought with them their own form of magic, an innate connection to mystical forces that existed independently of the chaos energy that would later flood the world. Their abilities manifested in ways that suggested centuries, perhaps millennia, of refinement and practice in their original homeworld. The arrival of elves shifted the balance of power on the continent. They established their own cities, grand structures of white stone and elegant architecture that contrasted sharply with the underground fortresses of gnomes and dwarfs. Elven society operated according to principles forged in another world, bringing customs, languages, and social hierarchies that reflected their long history as a spacefaring people capable of choosing their homes from among countless possible spheres. Relations between elves and the earlier inhabitants ranged from cautious cooperation to outright hostility, with territorial disputes erupting in regions where both groups claimed sovereignty. Some dwarven holds established trade agreements with elven settlements, exchanging goods and knowledge. Other regions saw conflict as expansion brought different peoples into competition for resources and land. The world continued in this state for uncounted generations. No one living in that ancient age could have predicted what approached. The elder races, for all their achievements and accumulated wisdom, possessed no warning of the dimensional catastrophe gathering like a cosmic storm across the multiverse. They could not know that their world would soon intersect with others, that creatures from dying spheres would pour through rifts torn in reality's fabric, that humans would arrive as refugees from destroyed worlds and eventually claim dominance over the continent through sheer numbers and adaptability. The elves particularly could not foresee that their greatest gift, the ability to traverse dimensions at will, would be stripped away by the very event that brought their kinsmen from distant spheres crashing into this one. The world before the conjunction of the spheres existed in stable equilibrium, its inhabitants navigating familiar challenges according to established patterns, unaware that everything they knew would soon be transformed beyond recognition. The elves who walked the continent before the conjunction possessed a gift that set them apart from every other race that had come before or would come after. They moved between worlds as naturally as travelers crossing from one kingdom to another, navigating dimensional boundaries through abilities woven into their very essence. The Aen Shade did not stumble upon this world through accident or catastrophe. They chose it deliberately, arriving through controlled passage from their distant sphere of origin, stepping from one reality into another with the confidence of those who had mastered an art that other races could barely comprehend, much less replicate. Their arrival marked a fundamental shift in the continent's balance of power, though the exact timeline remains obscured by the passage of centuries and the loss of records in later catastrophes. The elves brought with them a civilization already ancient by the standards of dwarfs and gnomes, carrying knowledge accumulated across multiple worlds and countless generations. Their ships left no archaeological trace, suggesting methods of travel that transcended physical vessels. The earliest evidence of elven presence manifests in the ruins of cities built according to architectural principles that seem to ignore the practical limitations that constrained other races, creating structures of impossible grace and beauty that still stand, weathered and abandoned, in remote corners of the continent. The magic the Aen Shade wielded differed fundamentally from what would later emerge after the conjunction. Theirs was an innate power, inherited through bloodlines and refined through centuries of practice, flowing from within rather than drawn from ambient sources. This distinction proved crucial in understanding the transformation that would occur when chaos flooded the world. Elven magic manifested in their ability to extend life far beyond natural spans, to heal wounds that would prove fatal to other races, to shape living wood and stone into forms that served their purposes without destroying the essential nature of the materials. They possessed an intuitive connection to the fabric of reality itself, allowing them to perceive threads of possibility that remained invisible to dwarven eyes or gnomish understanding. The Aen Shade established their cities in forests and along coastlines, preferring regions where the natural world remained relatively untouched by the underground mining operations of dwarfs or the agricultural clearances of halflings. Their settlements reflected philosophies developed across multiple worlds, incorporating elements that suggested exposure to environments radically different from the continent's temperate forests and mountain ranges. Some structures incorporated designs suited for worlds with different gravitational constants or atmospheric compositions, architectural choices that made little practical sense in their new home yet persisted through cultural memory and aesthetic preference. The elves brought their own systems of governance, their own religious beliefs centered on deities whose names would later be recorded in fragmentary texts preserved by human scholars attempting to reconstruct pre-conjunction history. Relations between the newly arrived elves and the established elder races ranged across the full spectrum of possibility. Some dwarven holds established trade agreements, exchanging metalwork and gemstones for elven magical services and exotic goods brought from other worlds. The elves possessed knowledge of metallurgy techniques unknown to even the most skilled dwarven smiths, offering innovations in exchange for access to mineral deposits and forging facilities. Halfling agricultural communities found markets for their produce in elven cities, where populations uninterested in farming required steady food supplies. Gnomish workshops collaborated with elven mags on projects that combined mechanical ingenuity with mystical enhancement, creating artifacts whose purposes remain mysterious to modern scholars examining fragmentary remains. Tensions arose inevitably where expansion brought different peoples into competition for territory and resources. The elves claimed vast forest regions as their sovereign domain, asserting rights over lands that dwarfs and gnomes considered unoccupied and therefore available for exploitation. Philosophical differences regarding the proper relationship between civilization and nature generated conflicts that occasionally escalated into armed confrontation. The elves possessed military capabilities enhanced by their magical abilities, giving them advantages in conflicts with races who relied primarily on conventional weapons and tactics. Several recorded clashes resulted in dwarven holds abandoned or elven settlements burned, though comprehensive histories of this period disappeared in the chaos that followed the conjunction. The Aen Shade maintained connection with their kindred in other worlds, particularly with the Aen El, who remained in the elves' original homeland. The exact nature of this connection remains unclear, though evidence suggests regular communication and possibly even physical travel between spheres. The elves treated world walking as a fundamental aspect of their existence, an ability as natural and essential as sight or hearing. This gift allowed them to draw upon resources, knowledge, and support from their scattered kindred across multiple dimensions, giving them advantages that made them seem nearly invincible to races confined to a single sphere of existence. The elves brought with them extensive knowledge of other races and species, having observed countless worlds during their travels. Their understanding of the multiverse structure, while incomplete, far exceeded anything that dwarfs or gnomes had conceived. They spoke of worlds dying from various causes, of spheres collapsing under the weight of apocalyptic events both natural and artificial. They described civilizations that had risen to heights of power and sophistication before falling into ruin, leaving behind only archaeological traces and cautionary tales. The elves considered themselves survivors and refugees in their own right, having abandoned previous homes as conditions deteriorated beyond the point where even their magic and technology could sustain habitable environments. Among the knowledge the Aen Shade carried from their homeworld came understanding of forces that shaped reality at fundamental levels. They comprehended dimensional boundaries as permeable rather than absolute, recognizing that under certain conditions, worlds could touch, overlap, or even merge. This knowledge remained largely theoretical, discussed in academic contexts by elven scholars examining cosmological principles rather than practical concerns requiring immediate attention. The elves assumed their ability to navigate between worlds would remain intact indefinitely, allowing them to abandon the continent if conditions ever deteriorated to the point where migration became necessary. The Aen Shade established institutions for preserving and transmitting their accumulated knowledge across generations. Great libraries rose in their cities, containing texts written in languages that predated their arrival on the continent, recording histories that stretched back through multiple worlds and countless centuries. Schools trained young elves in the proper use of their innate magical abilities, teaching disciplines that required decades to master even for a race capable of living centuries without succumbing to age. The elves developed arts, literature, and music reflecting their unique perspective as wanderers between worlds, creating works that express themes of longing, exile, beauty, and loss in forms that other races struggled to fully appreciate or understand. The centuries passed, measured differently by different races according to their varied lifespans and cultural perspectives. For the elves, time moved slowly, each year representing a small fraction of individual lifespans that could extend for hundreds of years under favorable conditions. They built their civilization on the continent with the patient confidence of those who assumed they would remain indefinitely, or until they chose to move on to some other world more suited to their needs and preferences. The Aen Shade could not have imagined that forces beyond their control or understanding would soon strip them of their greatest gift, trapping them permanently in a world that would transform around them into something unrecognizable, leaving them stranded among monsters and surrounded by humans who would eventually reduce them from masters of reality itself to persecuted minorities clinging to remnants of faded glory. While the Aen Shade established their civilization on the continent, their kindred in another sphere faced a crisis that would ultimately transform the fate of multiple worlds. The Aen elves who had remained in their original homeland rather than migrating to other dimensions, watched their world succumb to forces beyond even their considerable power to control. The White Frost, as it came to be known in prophecy and legend, represented an existential threat of such magnitude that it forced decisions that would ripple across dimensional boundaries and reshape the very fabric of reality itself. The White Frost manifested as an apocalyptic climate catastrophe, a creeping cold that spread across the Aen elves' homeworld with inexorable certainty. This represented more than seasonal changes or temporary weather patterns. The phenomenon altered fundamental atmospheric and geological processes, transforming fertile lands into frozen wastelands where life could not persist. Temperatures dropped beyond the tolerance of most living things. Ice sheets expanded across continents. Ecosystems collapsed as plants died and animals perished or migrated to increasingly scarce habitable zones. The Aen, despite their magical abilities and accumulated knowledge from observing countless worlds, found themselves facing a threat that transcended their capacity to reverse or even significantly delay. The cause of the White Frost remains a matter of scholarly debate even in the accounts preserved through fragments and legends. Some sources suggest natural astronomical processes, shifts in orbital patterns or axial tilt that altered the amount of solar radiation reaching the planet's surface. Others point to more mysterious origins, perhaps connected to the fundamental aging of the sphere itself or consequences of ancient magical workings whose effects accumulated across millennia. The Aen themselves apparently could not definitively identify the source, though they devoted considerable resources to understanding the phenomenon in hopes of discovering means to counteract it. Their failure in this endeavor forced them to consider alternatives that would have seemed unthinkable under less desperate circumstances. The elves possessed certain advantages in facing this crisis. Their longevity meant individuals could witness the progression of climate change across centuries, accumulating direct observational data rather than relying on historical records passed between generations. Their magical abilities allowed them to sustain themselves in conditions that would prove fatal to shorter-lived races. They created enclaves protected by spells that maintained habitable temperatures and growing conditions even as the surrounding landscape transformed into ice and stone. These refuges bought time, allowing elven civilization to persist decades or even centuries longer than would otherwise have been possible, though everyone understood such measures represented temporary respites rather than permanent solutions. During this extended twilight of their world, the Aen explored every possible avenue for salvation. They studied the White Frost intensively, mapping its progression and analyzing its mechanisms. They experimented with magical techniques intended to warm the atmosphere or redirect weather patterns. They considered engineering solutions involving artificial heat sources or protective barriers around habitable zones. They investigated whether their world-walking abilities might allow them to somehow shift their entire planet into a more favorable dimensional position. Each approach failed or proved impractical at the scale necessary to save a dying world. The Aen gradually accepted that they could not prevent the White Frost, leaving them with the grim necessity of abandoning their homeland or perishing alongside it. This realization forced confrontation with a troubling reality. While individual elves could travel between worlds, moving an entire civilization proved far more complex. The number of elves requiring evacuation exceeded anything their traditional methods could accommodate. Furthermore, many suitable destination worlds already hosted established populations who might resist large-scale elven immigration. The Enel needed stable portals capable of transporting masses of people and resources, gateways that could remain open long enough to facilitate organized migration rather than chaotic refugee flight. Creating such passages required power beyond what the elves could generate through their innate abilities alone. In their desperation, the Enel turned to beings whose understanding of dimensional mechanics surpassed even elven knowledge. Unicorns, creatures that existed across multiple spheres simultaneously and possessed innate comprehension of cosmic processes that remained mysterious to other species, represented the elves' best hope for achieving the controlled dimensional passages they required. These beings had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, observing the patterns of creation and destruction that characterized reality at fundamental levels. The unicorns understood forces that shaped dimensional boundaries, maintaining the separation between spheres while occasionally allowing controlled passage between them. The relationship between unicorns and the Enel carried complexity that transcended simple cooperation. Unicorns possessed their own perspectives on the proper order of reality, viewing the multiverse through frameworks developed across timescales that dwarfed even elven longevity. They recognized that excessive manipulation of dimensional boundaries risked consequences that might spread far beyond any single world or sphere. The fabric of reality maintained its integrity through careful balance, and actions taken in one dimension inevitably affected others in ways both subtle and profound. Unicorns approached requests for dimensional intervention with extreme caution, weighing potential consequences against immediate benefits. The Enel presented their case with eloquence born of desperation. They emphasized their accomplishments as a civilization, their contributions to knowledge and culture across multiple worlds, the tragedy of allowing such achievements to vanish beneath advancing ice. They argued that helping elven refugees relocate to suitable spheres represented mercy rather than dangerous tampering, preserving valuable perspectives and capabilities that might prove essential to other worlds facing their own existential challenges. They appealed to whatever emotions or principles motivated unicorns, seeking common ground that might persuade these enigmatic beings to provide the assistance that represented the elves' only realistic hope for survival. After deliberation whose duration and nature remain obscured by time and incomplete records, certain unicorns agreed to help. They opened the Gate of Odgaith, a stable portal linking the Enel's dying world to other spheres where elven refugees might find sanctuary. This represented an extraordinary act, requiring sustained effort to maintain dimensional passages against the natural tendency of boundaries to reassert themselves. The unicorns who participated in this endeavor committed themselves to an ongoing project that would continue indefinitely, binding themselves to the gate's maintenance for as long as the Enel required access to escape routes from their collapsing homeland. The creation of Odgaith provided temporary relief, allowing elves to begin evacuating to safer dimensions. However, tensions emerged between unicorns and their elven beneficiaries. The Enel, focused on saving their civilization, pushed for expanding the gate's capacity and opening additional passages to multiple destinations. The unicorns, increasingly concerned about the cumulative effects of maintaining large-scale dimensional breaches, resisted these demands. They observed how the Enel's use of the gate began generating unexpected side effects, subtle distortions in dimensional stability that suggested broader problems might develop if current practices continued unchecked. These concerns proved tragically prophetic. The intensive manipulation of dimensional boundaries, combined with whatever underlying instabilities already affected the multiverse, contributed to conditions that would ultimately trigger the conjunction of the spheres itself. The unicorns recognized warning signs that the elves, in their desperation to save themselves, could not or would not acknowledge. Tensions escalated into outright conflict as unicorns attempted to restrict access to the gate while elves fought to maintain evacuation routes from their dying world. This struggle between species who had once cooperated in attempting to circumvent apocalypse played out against the background of mounting cosmic instability that would soon overwhelm all efforts at controlled dimensional navigation. The Enel could not have known that their attempt to escape one catastrophe would contribute to triggering another, one that would affect not just their world or their chosen refuges, but ripple across multiple dimensions simultaneously, shattering the careful boundaries that had kept spheres separate and mixing populations, species, and forces in combinations that would transform every world they touched. Approximately 1500 years before Geralt of Rivia would walk the roads of the Northern Kingdoms, reality itself fractured across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The event that scholars would later term the conjunction of the spheres represented a cosmic catastrophe of such magnitude that civilizations had no framework for comprehending what occurred. Worlds that had existed in separate dimensional spaces, isolated from one another by barriers woven into the fundamental structure of the multiverse, suddenly intersected. The boundaries that maintained order across countless spheres of existence weakened and collapsed, creating passages between realms that had never before touched. The cause of this dimensional collapse remains a matter of scholarly speculation even in the era when sorcerers could manipulate chaos energy and study the underlying structures of reality. No definitive explanation exists in any preserved text or oral tradition. Some scholars proposed astronomical explanations, suggesting alignments of celestial bodies across multiple dimensions that created gravitational resonances capable of weakening dimensional boundaries. Others pointed to the accumulated effects of magical workings across many worlds, arguing that intelligent species manipulation of mystical forces gradually eroded the barriers separating spheres until they finally gave way. The Enel's desperate attempts to create stable portals for evacuation from their dying world may have contributed to mounting stresses on dimensional integrity, though whether their actions triggered the conjunction or merely coincided with it remains impossible to determine. The term conjunction itself suggests orderly alignment, celestial bodies moving into precise configuration according to predictable patterns. This terminology proves misleading when applied to the actual chaos of the event. The conjunction manifested as violent collision rather than gentle touching, dimensional boundaries shattering rather than gracefully overlapping. Rifts tore open across space and time, appearing without warning in locations both inhabited and wilderness. Some remained open for years or even decades, creating semi-permanent gateways between worlds. Others flickered into existence for moments before collapsing, allowing only brief passages that trapped whoever or whatever crossed through before the portal closed. The distribution of these rifts followed no apparent pattern, suggesting random occurrence rather than design or natural law. The scholarly term interpenetration appears in some texts as an alternative description of what occurred. This word captures the reality that worlds did not merely touch at their edges. Rather, they merged partially, dimensional spaces occupying the same physical location simultaneously in defiance of normal geometric principles. A person might walk through a forest on the continent and find themselves stepping into a completely different world without crossing any visible threshold, passing through a zone where two spheres occupied overlapping space. The disorientation and danger inherent in such transitions proved catastrophic for many who encountered them, as environments on different sides of interpenetration zones varied wildly in basic characteristics like atmospheric composition, temperature, or even the direction of gravitational pull. The multiverse contained countless spheres, each hosting its own worlds with unique characteristics, populations, and histories. The conjunction affected an unknown number of these dimensions simultaneously. Evidence suggests at least a dozen different spheres made contact with the world that would become known as the continent, though the actual number may have been far higher. Each sphere that touched this world brought its own contributions to the chaos, depositing creatures, energies, and occasionally refugees who found themselves stranded far from home. The effect cascaded across dimensional boundaries, as spheres that touched the continent might also have been touching other worlds, creating chains of connection that spread disruption across vast regions of the multiverse. The immediate physical effects of the conjunction proved devastating to established civilizations. The sudden appearance of rifts destroyed buildings and settlements unlucky enough to occupy space where dimensional tears manifested. Entire communities vanished overnight, swallowed by portals that deposited their populations in alien worlds where survival proved impossible. Conversely, structures and landscape features from other dimensions appeared on the continent without warning, creating bizarre juxtapositions where architectural styles from incompatible cultures stood side by side or alien vegetation sprouted amid native forests. The geographic disruption alone would have represented a significant catastrophe, displacing populations and destroying infrastructure that had taken generations to build. The conjunction's duration remains unclear from surviving accounts. Some sources suggest the most intense period of dimensional instability lasted only days or weeks, during which time the vast majority of rifts opened and closed. Others indicate that dimensional boundaries remained permeable for years, with new portals continuing to appear sporadically long after the initial catastrophe. The gradual stabilization of reality proceeded at different rates across different regions, with some areas experiencing ongoing dimensional instability for decades while others returned to relative normalcy within months. This variation in the conjunction's local effects created additional confusion, as communities attempting to understand what had happened received contradictory reports from other regions describing vastly different experiences. The elder races found themselves confronting phenomena beyond their capacity to understand or control. Dwarven stonework, crafted to withstand earthquakes and the erosion of centuries, proved useless against dimensional rifts that ignored physical barriers. Elven magic, powerful as it was, could not seal portals that operated according to principles that transcended their accumulated knowledge. The gnomes' technical expertise provided no defense against creatures that appeared from thin air or environmental conditions that shifted without warning. The halflings watched their carefully cultivated fields overrun by invasive species from other worlds. Plants and animals that disrupted ecosystems evolved over millions of years. The psychological impact of the conjunction may have exceeded even the physical devastation. Every foundational assumption about the nature of reality proved incorrect. The world revealed itself as merely one among countless others, vulnerable to forces operating at scales that made individual lives or even entire civilizations seem insignificant. The appearance of creatures from other dimensions demonstrated that the elder races, for all their achievements, represented only a small fraction of the diversity of intelligent life across the multiverse. Some of these newcomers possessed capabilities that dwarfed anything the continent's inhabitants could accomplish, while others arrived as desperate refugees from dying worlds, carrying with them knowledge of catastrophes that could befall any sphere given sufficient time or bad fortune. The chaos energy that would transform magical practice flooded into the world during the conjunction, mixing with existing mystical forces in combinations that created new possibilities and new dangers. This influx represented more than simple addition of energy from multiple sources. The chaos from different dimensions possessed distinct characteristics, having been shaped by different physical laws and different patterns of use. When these variant forms of chaos merged, they created something novel, an ambient magical energy that would prove accessible to species who had never before possessed any mystical abilities. The implications of this transformation would take decades to fully manifest, as individuals learned through trial and error how to access and manipulate the new magic saturating their world. The conjunction stripped the elves of their world-walking abilities through mechanisms that remained mysterious even to those who experienced the loss. The dimensional boundaries that stabilized after the initial chaos settled into configurations different from what had existed before. The pathways that elves had navigated within ATs no longer existed in recognizable form, replaced by structures that their abilities could not parse or traverse. The Aen Shade found themselves trapped on the continent, unable to return to whatever homeworld they had originally departed or to reach the Enel in their distant sphere. This separation would prove permanent, dividing kindred who had maintained connection across dimensional boundaries for uncounted generations. The conjunction of the spheres concluded as mysteriously as it had begun. The dimensional boundaries restabilized, the rifts closed, the interpenetration zones disappeared. The spheres that had collided drifted apart in whatever dimensional space they occupied, returning to isolation from one another. Those who had crossed through portals during the period of instability found themselves permanently stranded, cut off from their home worlds with no possibility of return. The multiverse resumed its normal configuration, but the worlds that had been touched by the conjunction would never return to their previous states. The populations, species, energies, and materials that had mixed during the chaos remained mixed, creating new realities that bore only superficial resemblance to what had existed before. The continent emerged from the conjunction transformed beyond recognition, hosting populations and creatures from a dozen different spheres, saturated with chaos energy that would enable new forms of magic, its geographical and ecological systems disrupted by the appearance and disappearance of features from alien worlds. The elder races who had thought themselves masters of their world now shared it with monsters, with humans, and with forces they could neither understand nor control. The age that followed would be defined by attempts to survive and adapt to this new reality, to build civilizations amid chaos, and to find ways of coping with a world that had proven itself far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The conjunction of the spheres transformed the fundamental nature of magic across all worlds it touched, introducing forces that would reshape civilizations and create possibilities that had never before existed. Among the most profound changes came the flood of chaos energy that poured into the continent from multiple dimensions simultaneously, mixing and combining in ways that generated something unprecedented. This chaos represented a primordial force present across countless spheres, existing in different forms and concentrations depending on the specific characteristics of each world. When dimensional boundaries collapsed and worlds interpenetrated, these variant manifestations of chaos merged into an ambient energy that saturated the atmosphere, the earth, and every living thing. Before the conjunction, magic on the continent existed in limited forms, accessible only to specific beings through innate abilities inherited genetically or granted by fundamental aspects of their nature. Elves wielded their ancestral magic, powers refined across generations and tied to bloodlines stretching back to times before they first began traveling between worlds. Unicorns possessed even more profound abilities, comprehending and manipulating reality at levels that suggested they existed partially outside normal space-time, observing and occasionally intervening in cosmic processes according to principles known only to themselves. These forms of magic functioned according to internal sources, drawing upon energies contained within the practitioners themselves rather than accessing external reservoirs of power. The chaos that flooded the world during the conjunction operated on entirely different principles. This energy existed independently of any individual practitioner, permeating the environment as an ambient force available to anyone who learned the techniques necessary for accessing and directing it. The distinction proved crucial in understanding how magic would evolve in the post-conjunction era. Where elven magic required specific genetic heritage and centuries of training to master subtle internal energies, chaos magic theoretically remained available to any species capable of developing the mental discipline and knowledge required to perceive and manipulate external forces. This democratization of magical potential would have profound consequences, though realizing those consequences required time and considerable experimentation by those willing to risk the dangers inherent in wielding primordial chaos. The nature of chaos itself resisted simple definition or categorization. Scholars who later studied the phenomenon described it as primordial creative and destructive potential, the raw material from which reality constructed itself and into which reality eventually dissolved. Chaos represented possibility in its purest form, unconstrained by the structures that gave order to physical existence. Accessing this force meant touching the fundamental malleability of the universe, the principle that allowed transformation, change, and the violation of natural laws that governed mundane existence. The power available to those who mastered chaos manipulation appeared nearly limitless, constrained only by the practitioner's knowledge, will, and ability to withstand the costs that wielding such power inevitably demanded. The arrival of chaos from multiple dimensions created concentrations of magical energy unprecedented in the continent's history. In certain locations, the interpenetration of spheres had been particularly intense, leaving behind zones where dimensional boundaries remained thinner than elsewhere, where the fabric of reality maintained a permanent instability that made magic easier to access and more powerful in its effects. These sites became focal points for later magical institutions, places where practitioners could study chaos under conditions that amplified their abilities and allowed experiments that would prove impossible in regions with lower ambient energy concentrations. The uneven distribution of chaos across the landscape meant that magical practice would develop differently in different regions, with schools and traditions reflecting local conditions and the specific challenges or opportunities those conditions created. The transformation of magical accessibility extended beyond humans to affect even those species who had previously possessed their own forms of innate power. Elves found their traditional magic altered by the presence of ambient chaos, creating hybrid techniques that combined ancestral abilities with new possibilities for external energy manipulation. Some elves adapted quickly, recognizing opportunities in the changed magical landscape. Others resisted, clinging to pure traditional practices and viewing chaos magic as corruption of their heritage. This philosophical divide would contribute to fractures within elven society, adding internal tensions to the external pressures created by the arrival of monsters and human refugees. The process by which chaos translated into tangible magical effects required understanding principles that had no precedent in pre-conjunction magical practice. Chaos existed as pure potential, formless and undirected until shaped by conscious will and knowledge into specific manifestations. A practitioner seeking to create fire through chaos manipulation did not simply wish for flames to appear. Rather, they imposed structure on primordial chaos, constraining infinite possibility into the specific form of combustion, directing energy according to principles drawn from both understanding of physical processes and mystical frameworks that existed partially outside physical law. The complexity of this operation meant that even simple magical effects required extensive training and mental discipline to execute reliably without catastrophic side effects. The fundamental principle governing chaos manipulation emerged gradually through trial, error, and considerable loss of life among early experimenters. Reality maintained balance through conservation laws that transcended any single sphere or dimension. To create required destroying something of equivalent value. To heal a wound demanded transferring vitality from another source. To conjure matter from apparent nothingness meant drawing substance from elsewhere, perhaps from another dimension or by converting existing materials into new forms. This principle of exchange and balance prevented unlimited creation or destruction, imposing limits on even the most powerful practitioners. Those who ignored or failed to understand this fundamental rule discovered that chaos would extract its price regardless of their intentions, often consuming the practitioner themselves when no other source of payment presented itself. The physical and mental costs of wielding chaos proved severe enough to eliminate many would-be practitioners before they progressed beyond initial experiments. The act of perceiving chaos required altering one's consciousness in ways that proved dangerous to unprepared minds. The channels through which chaos flowed into physical reality passed through the practitioner's body and mind, exposing them to energies that could burn, corrupt, or transform living tissue in unpredictable ways. Extended use of chaos magic generated cumulative damage that manifested in various forms depending on the individual and the specific techniques employed. Sterility emerged as one of the most common consequences, particularly among female practitioners, as reproductive systems proved especially vulnerable to chaos exposure. Other effects included accelerated aging in some regions of the body while others remained preserved, mental instability from prolonged contact with primordial forces that existed beyond normal causality, and physical mutations that gradually transformed practitioners into something no longer entirely human or elven. The introduction of chaos magic fundamentally altered the balance of power among the continent's inhabitants. Species that had never possessed magical abilities suddenly gained access to forces that could match or exceed the natural advantages of elves or other elder races. Humans, physically weaker and shorter-lived than elves, discovered that properly trained mags could achieve effects beyond anything elven heritage magic could accomplish. This leveling of capability through learned rather than inherited power would prove crucial in allowing humanity to eventually achieve dominance despite arriving as refugees from destroyed worlds. The elder races, accustomed to superiority based on longevity and natural abilities, found themselves confronting opponents who wielded the same primordial forces that shaped reality itself. The chaos that flooded the continent during the conjunction remained permanently embedded in the world structure after dimensional boundaries restabilized. Unlike the temporary rifts that eventually closed or the interpenetration zones that disappeared when spheres separated, the ambient chaos energy became a permanent feature of post-conjunction reality. Future generations would grow up in a world saturated with magical potential, accepting as normal what would have seemed miraculous or impossible to pre-conjunction inhabitants. The presence of chaos shaped evolution and development across all species, creating subtle changes in physiology and consciousness that accumulated across generations. Some individuals manifested unusual sensitivity to chaos, perceiving magical currents invisible to others or unconsciously manipulating ambient energy without formal training. The transformation of magic from rare inherited gift to learnable skill accessible through study and sacrifice represented perhaps the conjunction's most lasting impact beyond the immediate catastrophe of dimensional collapse. The subsequent development of magical institutions, the rise of sorcerers and sorceresses as political and military powers, the creation of enhanced beings like witches through alchemical manipulation of chaos-touched biology, all trace their origins to the moment when multiple dimensions collided and poured their combined chaos into a world unprepared for such profound transformation. The continent would never return to the stable, magic-limited existence it had known before, instead entering an age where reality itself remained perpetually malleable for those willing to master the dangerous art of shaping primordial chaos into forms that served human or elven purposes, regardless of the personal costs such mastery inevitably demanded. The dimensional rifts that tore open during the conjunction of the spheres served as gateways not merely for abstract energies or geographical features, but for living creatures fleeing catastrophe or simply caught in the cosmic chaos that swept across multiple worlds simultaneously. These beings, torn from their native spheres and deposited on the continent, represented species adapted to environments radically different from what they encountered. Some arrived as refugees from dying worlds, desperately seeking any habitable dimension that might support their continued existence. Others came through accident, dragged through temporary portals without intention or understanding, finding themselves stranded in an alien reality with no possibility of return. The inhabitants of the continent would come to classify these invaders under a single categorical term that encompassed vast diversity of form, origin, and nature: monsters. The creatures that emerged from dimensional rifts defied any simple taxonomy, representing adaptations to worlds whose physical laws and environmental conditions varied wildly from the continent's temperate forests and mountain ranges. Necrophages, beings that fed upon decaying organic matter, arrived from spheres where death dominated life to such an extent that evolution favored species capable of extracting sustenance from corpses rather than hunting living prey. These creatures possessed physiologies optimized for detecting decomposition, digestive systems capable of processing tissue in various stages of rot, and behavioral patterns that drew them unerringly to sites of mass casualties or burial grounds. Their arrival on the continent proved particularly catastrophic given the widespread loss of life during the conjunction itself, as necrophages discovered abundant food sources in communities devastated by dimensional rifts and unable to properly dispose of their deceased. Ghouls emerged as among the most common necrophages to establish permanent populations on the continent. These creatures demonstrated remarkable adaptability to their new environment, thriving in climates ranging from frozen northern wastes to southern swamps. Their grey, hairless skin possessed toughness that resisted casual harm, while claws and teeth evolved for tearing through partially preserved flesh proved equally effective against living defenders who attempted to drive them from burial sites or battlefields. Ghouls gathered in packs, displaying rudimentary social organization that allowed coordinated hunting and defense of feeding territories. Their reproductive rate exceeded that of most native species, enabling rapid population expansion in regions where food sources remained abundant and organized resistance remained limited. Drowners occupied a distinct ecological niche among the necrophages, preferring aquatic or semi-aquatic environments where they lurked in shallow waters waiting for victims to approach. These creatures possessed adaptations suggesting origin in a world where land and water boundaries remained fluid, perhaps a sphere dominated by swamps or tidal zones that shifted constantly between submersion and exposure. Their ability to hold breath for extended periods, combined with webbed appendages and eyes capable of functioning underwater, made them formidable ambush predators in rivers, lakes, and coastal regions. Communities that had safely drawn water from the same sources for generations suddenly found those familiar places transformed into death traps where drowners seized unwary travelers and dragged them beneath the surface. The arrival of vampires represented an entirely different category of crisis, as these beings possessed intelligence and capabilities that placed them on par with or exceeding the elder races in certain domains. Vampires originated from a sphere where their species had apparently achieved sophisticated civilization before some catastrophe forced them into dimensional exile. Unlike mindless necrophages driven by instinct to seek carrion, vampires demonstrated complex social structures, cultural practices, and individual personalities as varied as those found among humans or elves. Their need for sustenance derived from living beings proved problematic for obvious reasons. Though vampire physiology allowed extended periods without feeding, and individual vampires developed widely varied approaches to obtaining necessary sustenance while coexisting with other intelligent species. Higher vampires, the most powerful and sophisticated of their kind, possessed abilities that rendered them nearly invulnerable to conventional means of harm. These beings could alter their physical form, assuming appearances ranging from monstrous to indistinguishable from humans. They commanded magical abilities that seemed innate rather than learned, suggesting that chaos manipulation or something analogous existed in their native sphere. Their regenerative capabilities allowed recovery from injuries that would prove instantly fatal to other species, and complete destruction of a higher vampire required methods so extreme that few who encountered them survived long enough to discover what might work. The presence of higher vampires forced recognition that some monsters possessed capabilities that transcended anything available to the continent's inhabitants, creating predators who could only be negotiated with or avoided rather than hunted and eliminated. Cursed ones emerged through different mechanisms than creatures who simply arrived from other dimensions. These beings represented transformations of native species, primarily humans, whose biology proved vulnerable to particular diseases or supernatural afflictions that the conjunction had introduced alongside purely physical monsters. Werewolves, perhaps the most recognizable cursed ones, resulted from infections that triggered radical physiological changes during certain lunar phases. The curse operated through mechanisms that combined mundane biology with mystical processes, creating transformations that defied natural law while apparently following their own consistent patterns. A person afflicted with lycanthropy would undergo forced metamorphosis from human form into something combining human and lupine characteristics, gaining enhanced strength, speed, and aggression while losing conscious control and reverting to predatory instinct. The question of which creatures existed on the continent before the conjunction versus which arrived during that event remains subject to scholarly debate. Draconids, the classification encompassing various dragon-like species, likely predated the dimensional catastrophe based on archaeological evidence suggesting their presence in ancient times when the elder races first arrived. Dragons themselves represented apex predators whose intelligence exceeded most other species, possessing abilities to manipulate magic and communicate in complex languages. Their rarity even in ancient times, combined with extremely long lifespans and low reproductive rates, meant that dragons never constituted a widespread threat to civilization despite their formidable individual capabilities. Lesser draconids like wyverns and forktails demonstrated more aggressive territorial behavior and higher population densities, creating ongoing challenges for communities established in regions these creatures claimed as hunting grounds. The ecological disruption caused by monster arrivals extended far beyond direct predation on intelligent species. Creatures adapted to alien environments displaced native species occupying similar ecological niches, creating cascading effects throughout food webs and disrupting systems that had achieved equilibrium over millions of years of evolution. Invasive species introduced diseases that native organisms possessed no resistance against, triggering population collapses among plants and animals that had no prior exposure to such pathogens. Monsters whose waste products contained compounds toxic in the continent's biochemistry contaminated water sources and soil, rendering previously fertile areas unsuitable for agriculture or habitation. The cumulative effect of these disruptions transformed landscapes that had supported thriving communities into hostile wilderness where survival required constant vigilance and adaptation to dangers that had never previously existed. The immediate response to monster arrivals proved inadequate across virtually all affected communities. The elder races possessed martial traditions developed for conflicts among intelligent opponents capable of strategy and negotiation. Their weapons and tactics assumed adversaries who valued their own survival and retreated when faced with superior force. Monsters operated according to different principles, driven by hunger or territorial instinct rather than political calculation, continuing attacks until eliminated or until prey escaped beyond pursuit range. A dwarven shield wall, impenetrable against conventional infantry, proved less effective against ghouls willing to accept casualties while seeking gaps in formation. Elven archery, devastating against armored knights, struggled to penetrate the thick hides or regenerative capabilities of certain monster species. Military forces trained for conventional warfare gradually adapted tactics specifically designed for monster encounters. Hunters specialized in tracking particular species learned behavioral patterns and vulnerabilities through observation and costly trial and error. Communities implemented defensive measures ranging from fortified walls designed to exclude specific threats to organized patrols that kept critical areas clear of monster incursions. The economic burden of maintaining these precautions proved substantial, diverting resources from productive activities into endless cycles of defense and reconstruction. Trade routes required armed escorts substantial enough to deter or defeat attacks, raising costs and making certain commerce economically unviable. Remote settlements faced impossible choices between abandonment or acceptance of constant attrition as monsters claimed victims faster than populations could replace through natural increase. The psychological impact of living in a world suddenly infested with monsters may have exceeded even the material destruction they caused. Communities that had existed for generations in relative security discovered that venturing beyond fortified settlements meant risking encounters with creatures that might appear without warning from forest or swamp or underground tunnel. Parents who had allowed children to play freely in familiar areas now kept them confined within sight, knowing that moments' inattention could result in tragedy. The night, previously merely inconvenient due to darkness, transformed into a period of acute danger when many monster species demonstrated peak activity. The world shrank as people abandoned areas that could not be adequately defended, concentrating in larger settlements that could maintain permanent protective measures. The arrival of monsters fundamentally altered the trajectory of civilization on the continent, creating challenges that would persist for centuries and ultimately drive the desperate measures that created witches as specialized monster hunters. The immediate aftermath of the conjunction saw populations struggling simply to survive against threats they possessed no effective means of countering, watching helplessly as creatures from dying worlds established themselves as permanent residents of a reality transformed beyond recognition by the collision of dimensions that had never been meant to touch. Among the refugees and creatures that emerged from dimensional rifts during the conjunction of the spheres came beings whose arrival would ultimately prove more consequential than any monster, any magic, or any geographical disruption the catastrophe produced. Humans, a species entirely absent from the continent before the dimensional collapse, found themselves deposited in a world they had never chosen to inhabit, survivors of catastrophes in their own native spheres that had driven them through unstable portals into unknown dimensions. These first human populations arrived during the chaos itself, emerging from rifts with nothing beyond what they carried and whatever knowledge they retained from worlds they would never see again. The Dork people established themselves as the earliest documented human culture on the continent, settling in regions whose exact location remains unclear from fragmentary historical records preserved through oral tradition and archaeological evidence. These humans arrived in small numbers initially, perhaps a few hundred individuals or at most several thousand, representing either single catastrophic displacement or accumulated arrivals through multiple portals over an extended period. The Dork possessed cultural characteristics suggesting origin in a sphere with technological and social development roughly equivalent to late Stone Age or early Bronze Age civilizations, bringing knowledge of agriculture, animal domestication, and basic metallurgy. They established permanent settlements rather than maintaining nomadic lifestyles, clearing land for cultivation and constructing defensive structures that provided protection against the monsters that infested their new homeland. The Wasgor culture emerged as the second distinct human group to arrive on the continent, though whether they came from the same sphere as the Dork or represented refugees from an entirely different world remains subject to scholarly debate. The Wasgor demonstrated cultural practices and technological capabilities distinct from the Dork, suggesting separate origins even if both groups belonged to the same species. Archaeological evidence indicates Wasgor settlements favored different geographic regions than Dork communities, perhaps reflecting preferences developed in their native sphere or practical decisions based on which territories remained unclaimed when they arrived. The relationship between Dork and Wasgor ranged from cautious trade to open conflict, competing for resources in a world already strained by monster predation and the general disruption following the conjunction. These early human populations found themselves occupying a world dominated by races whose civilizations had existed for centuries or millennia before human arrival. The elder races possessed technological advantages, magical abilities, longer lifespans, and established territorial claims backed by military force. Humans arrived as powerless refugees, lacking even basic understanding of the geography, ecology, or political structures that governed their new home. The Dork and Wasgor faced immediate challenges that would have eliminated less adaptable species, forced to simultaneously defend against monsters while establishing agriculture in unfamiliar soil, locating potable water sources, and learning which native plants proved edible versus poisonous. The elder race's response to human arrival varied depending on circumstances, existing territorial pressures, and individual attitudes toward the refugees. Some dwarven holds provided limited assistance, recognizing that humans represented potential trading partners rather than direct competitors for underground territories dwarfs preferred. Certain elven communities viewed humans with curiosity tempered by caution, observing these newcomers as they might study any novel species that appeared in their domains. Other groups responded with outright hostility, viewing human settlements as unwanted intrusions into territories already claimed and seeing no obligation to assist refugees whose arrival they had not invited. Halfling communities, themselves smaller and less militarily powerful than dwarfs or elves, generally maintained neutral relations with early humans, engaging in trade when mutually beneficial while avoiding conflicts their limited numbers could not sustain. The primitive state of Dork and Wasgor societies relative to established elder race civilizations created power imbalances that shaped early human experience on the continent. Humans possessed no magical abilities, lacking both the innate powers of elves and the accumulated knowledge that might have allowed early access to chaos manipulation techniques. Their metallurgy produced weapons and tools inferior to dwarven craftsmanship refined across generations. Their architectural capabilities could not match elven constructions or gnomish engineering. Even their longevity proved drastically shorter than elves or dwarfs, creating situations where individual humans might negotiate with the same elder who had dealt with their grandparents, perpetuating unequal relationships across generations. Human populations demonstrated certain advantages that would eventually prove decisive despite their initial disadvantages. Reproductive rates exceeded those of elder races by substantial margins, allowing rapid population growth in regions where adequate resources permitted sustaining larger communities. Human adaptability manifested in willingness to settle territories that elves considered undesirable and in dietary flexibility that allowed survival on wider ranges of available foods. The shorter generational cycle meant humans could accumulate cultural knowledge and technological innovations more rapidly in evolutionary terms, though individual humans learned less within their lifetimes than elves who might study a subject for centuries. These advantages remained largely invisible during the immediate post-conjunction period, when survival dominated all other considerations and population numbers remained too small to demonstrate their full potential. The arrival of humans during the conjunction coincided with the flood of chaos energy that would transform magical practice across the continent. Early humans showed no particular aptitude for chaos manipulation initially, lacking frameworks for even conceptualizing magical forces that elder races had observed or wielded for generations. The discovery that humans could learn to access ambient chaos would come later, emerging through observation of elven techniques and desperate experimentation by individuals seeking any advantage that might improve their chances of survival. This development would take decades or even centuries to manifest in organized magical traditions, as humans gradually developed training methods and theoretical frameworks adapted to their own physiological and psychological characteristics rather than simply copying elven practices developed for fundamentally different biology. The scattered distribution of early human settlements reflected the random nature of their arrival through dimensional rifts appearing across the continent without apparent pattern. Dork communities might be separated by hundreds of miles, isolated from others of their culture and forced to develop independently according to local conditions. This fragmentation prevented formation of large political entities capable of asserting significant power, keeping humans divided into small tribes and villages vulnerable to external threats. The lack of centralized authority meant individual communities negotiated separately with elder race nations or monster threats, unable to call upon larger populations for mutual defense or coordinate responses to continent-wide challenges. Historical records documenting the Dork and Wasgor periods remain frustratingly incomplete, preserved primarily through oral traditions passed down through generations and subject to all the distortions such transmission entails. The elder races who observed early humans apparently considered them insufficiently important to warrant detailed written documentation, viewing them as curiosities or minor nuisances rather than significant historical actors. Human literacy developed slowly, and early written records focused on practical matters like resource management or religious observances rather than comprehensive histories. The subsequent arrival of later human waves, particularly the Nordlings, further obscured early histories as new populations overwhelmed and eventually absorbed or displaced the original Dork and Wasgor cultures. The environmental challenges facing early humans extended beyond monster threats to include diseases for which they possessed no natural immunity, developed in isolation from the biological systems that had evolved on the continent across millions of years. New pathogens proved devastating to populations lacking exposure and resistance, periodically sweeping through settlements and eliminating substantial percentages of inhabitants. The humans likely brought their own diseases from native spheres, potentially infecting elder race populations and contributing to demographic declines among groups who had never encountered such illnesses. These biological exchanges remained poorly documented, though their effects probably contributed significantly to mortality rates and population patterns throughout the post-conjunction period. The period of Dork and Wasgor dominance among human populations lasted several centuries, exact duration remaining uncertain due to inconsistent chronology in surviving records. During this era, humans established themselves as permanent inhabitants of the continent, learning to survive and eventually thrive in an environment initially hostile to their presence. They adapted agricultural techniques to local conditions, identified native plants suitable for cultivation, domesticated animals that would serve as livestock, and developed hunting strategies effective against both natural prey and certain monster species. The accumulation of practical knowledge transformed humans from helpless refugees into established communities capable of defending themselves and maintaining stable populations across generations. The arrival of humans during the conjunction of the spheres introduced an element whose full significance would only become apparent centuries later. These early populations, primitive and powerless as they appeared to elder races accustomed to dominance, carried within themselves potential that would ultimately reshape the entire political and cultural landscape of the continent. The Dork and Wasgor represented merely the first wave, pioneers who established initial footholds and accumulated survival knowledge that would benefit later arrivals. The true transformation of human fortunes awaited the mysterious landing of exiles, when much larger populations would arrive under circumstances that remain unclear even to scholars examining fragmentary evidence from that distant era, bringing with them the ancestors of the northern kingdoms that would eventually dominate the continent and reduce even the proud elves to marginalized minorities in lands they had once ruled as their own. The conjunction of the spheres transformed existence for every species it touched, displacing populations and mixing dimensions that had evolved separately across incomprehensible spans of time. Among all the changes wrought by this cosmic catastrophe, few proved more devastating than what befell the elven peoples scattered across multiple spheres. The Aen Shade, those elves who had settled on the continent before the conjunction, found themselves severed from their kindred in other dimensions, stripped of the very abilities that had defined their identity as a people capable of traversing the boundaries between worlds with the ease that other species might cross rivers or mountain passes. The loss manifested suddenly during the chaos of dimensional collapse. Elves who had navigated between spheres throughout their lives discovered pathways that had always existed now blocked or transformed beyond recognition. The dimensional boundaries that restabilized after the initial catastrophe settled into configurations entirely different from previous structures. Where before clear passages had existed, permeable zones that elven consciousness could perceive and traverse, now stood barriers impenetrable to even the most skilled world walkers. The mechanisms that had allowed dimensional travel, whether biological adaptations or mystical techniques developed across generations, ceased to function in a multiverse restructured by forces beyond any species' capacity to control or predict. The Aen Shade found themselves trapped on the continent without possibility of return to whatever homeworld their ancestors had departed generations or centuries earlier. Those who had maintained contact with elven populations in other spheres through regular dimensional travel suddenly faced permanent separation from family, friends, and cultural institutions that existed beyond newly impassable barriers. The isolation extended beyond mere physical separation. The accumulated knowledge, artistic traditions, and magical techniques that elves had shared across multiple spheres became inaccessible to populations now confined to single dimensions. Each group of stranded elves possessed only fragments of their species' total cultural heritage, missing vast portions that had been maintained by kindred in other worlds. The Aen, trapped in their own dying sphere far from the continent, suffered parallel tragedy. Their desperate attempts to evacuate refugees from the advancing white frost had contributed to the dimensional instability that triggered the conjunction, yet the catastrophe they helped create eliminated their escape routes while leaving them still vulnerable to the apocalyptic climate change that had motivated evacuation efforts in the first place. The Gate of Odd Gaith, created through unicorn assistance to provide stable passage between worlds, either closed during the conjunction or became inaccessible through whatever dimensional restructuring occurred. The Aen found themselves sealed within their dying world, watching the white frost advance while possessing no means of reaching the Aen Shade or any other elven population that might provide refuge or assistance. The separation between Aen Shade and Aen would prove permanent across the centuries that followed the conjunction. These kindred groups, divided by dimensional barriers that now functioned as absolute walls rather than permeable boundaries, evolved separately in isolation from each other. The Aen Shade adapted to life on the continent, competing with elder races who had preceded them and eventually facing displacement by human populations whose numbers grew exponentially. The Aen developed their own responses to confinement in a dying world, eventually discovering alternative means of creating limited dimensional passages that would allow small groups to reach other spheres for brief periods, manifesting in later eras as the Wild Hunt, spectral riders who appeared during certain conditions to abduct individuals possessing specific genetic characteristics the Aen required for their own purposes. The psychological impact of losing world-walking abilities may have exceeded even the practical consequences of dimensional confinement. Elven identity had been fundamentally shaped by their status as travelers between spheres, beings whose perspective encompassed multiple worlds and whose understanding transcended the limited viewpoints of species confined to single dimensions. This gift had made elves unique among all the species they encountered, providing advantages in knowledge, resources, and strategic flexibility that compensated for their relatively low reproductive rates and limited population numbers. The sudden loss of this defining characteristic forced profound reassessment of identity and purpose among populations that had considered themselves masters of reality itself, capable of choosing their homes from among countless possible worlds. The transformation extended beyond merely blocking existing pathways between dimensions. The fundamental nature of reality had shifted in ways that made the old techniques for world walking obsolete. The conjunction had mixed chaos energies from multiple spheres, creating ambient magical conditions entirely different from what had existed before. The elves' innate magical abilities, refined across generations in pre-conjunction reality, functioned less effectively or required adaptation to new conditions. Some traditional techniques ceased working entirely, their underlying principles violated by restructured physical and mystical laws. Elven magic, which had once represented the pinnacle of mystical achievement, suddenly became merely one form of power among several, losing its absolute advantages as chaos magic emerged accessible to species who had never before possessed any magical capabilities. The architectural and cultural achievements of elven civilization reflected assumptions about permanence and accessibility that the conjunction rendered invalid. Elven cities had been designed with the expectation that populations could relocate to other spheres if conditions deteriorated or opportunities emerged elsewhere. Important institutions maintained distributed operations across multiple worlds, coordinating activities through regular dimensional travel. Knowledge repositories stored portions of their collections in different spheres, creating redundancy that protected against loss while making complete archives accessible only through world walking. The conjunction transformed these strategic decisions into vulnerabilities, leaving populations with incomplete access to their own cultural heritage and institutions suddenly isolated from components essential to their proper function. The separation from elven populations in other dimensions left the Aen Shade vulnerable during the challenging centuries following the conjunction. They could no longer call upon kindred in other spheres for assistance during crises, draw upon accumulated resources distributed across multiple worlds, or coordinate responses to threats with allies possessing different perspectives and capabilities. Each isolated elven population faced its challenges alone, deprived of the broader network that had previously provided support and resilience. This isolation proved particularly devastating as human populations expanded and began competing seriously for territorial control, as elves lacked the numerical superiority necessary to resist through military force alone and could no longer compensate through access to resources and reinforcements from other dimensions. The loss of world-walking abilities occurred gradually for some elves over the period of dimensional instability rather than all at once. Individual elves described experiencing disorientation when attempting traditional techniques, finding pathways that seemed to lead somewhere unexpected or discovering that passages they had used countless times no longer existed in perceptible form. Some elves vanished during the conjunction period, last seen attempting dimensional travel as reality collapsed around them, their ultimate fates unknown. These disappearances created additional trauma for communities already struggling with the chaos of monster arrivals, human refugees, and fundamental changes to magical practice. Families mourned members who had departed for other spheres just before the conjunction sealed boundaries, leaving survivors uncertain whether their loved ones had reached destinations safely or perished during dimensional collapse. The elves' traditional relationship with unicorns deteriorated significantly in the aftermath of the conjunction. These beings, who had reluctantly agreed to help the Aen create stable portals for evacuation, apparently blamed elven desperation and demands for expanded dimensional access as contributing factors to the catastrophe that followed. Unicorns withdrew from contact with elven populations, refusing assistance or cooperation and leaving elves to navigate the transformed reality without guidance from beings whose understanding of cosmic processes exceeded anything elven knowledge encompassed. This loss of alliance eliminated another advantage elves had previously enjoyed, further reducing their capabilities relative to other species adapting to post-conjunction conditions. The recognition that world walking might be permanently lost rather than temporarily interrupted came gradually across decades as reality stabilized and dimensional boundaries showed no signs of returning to previous configurations. Elven scholars studied the new structure of dimensional barriers, seeking methods for restoring passage or developing alternative techniques that might function under changed conditions. These efforts consumed considerable resources and occupied some of their finest minds, yet produced no breakthroughs that restored lost abilities. The failure of these investigations forced acceptance that something fundamental had changed, that the multiverse now operated according to principles incompatible with traditional elven world-walking regardless of how much knowledge or power might be directed toward the problem. The Aen Shade's confinement to the continent would shape their history across all subsequent centuries, contributing to decisions and circumstances that ultimately led to their displacement by human populations. Trapped in a single world without escape routes if conditions deteriorated, elves fought more desperately to maintain territorial control than they might have if dimensional travel remained possible as a fallback option. The conflicts between elves and expanding human populations carried existential stakes for elves in ways that humans, who had nowhere else to go regardless of outcomes, perhaps failed to fully appreciate. The tragedy of the elven peoples lay not merely in their defeat by more numerous adversaries, but in how the conjunction had stripped them of the very capabilities that had once made them unique among all species, reducing them from dimensional travelers who chose their homes among infinite possibilities to refugees trapped in a single world watching helplessly as everything they had built slowly crumbled under pressures they lacked the numbers or resources to resist. The decades immediately following the conjunction of the spheres witnessed societal collapse across vast regions of the continent, as civilizations that had existed for centuries found themselves incapable of responding effectively to compound crises that overwhelmed every institution and tested every assumption about the nature of reality. The elder races, who had built sophisticated cultures refined across generations, discovered that accumulated knowledge and technological achievement provided inadequate defense against dimensional rifts depositing monsters in settled territories, chaos energy transforming the fundamental rules governing magical practice, and human refugees appearing in numbers sufficient to strain already stressed resources. The world descended into an era that would later be remembered as a time of darkness, when survival superseded all other concerns and the maintenance of civilization itself seemed uncertain. The monsters that poured through dimensional rifts during the conjunction continued arriving for years after the initial catastrophe, as portals flickered intermittently rather than closing simultaneously. Communities that survived the first wave of creatures found themselves facing additional incursions months or years later, preventing any return to stability and forcing perpetual readiness for threats that appeared without warning or pattern. The unpredictability of monster arrivals meant defensive measures remained necessarily reactive rather than strategic, responding to crises as they emerged rather than implementing comprehensive solutions. Settlements established watch systems and maintained armed patrols, diverting labor from productive activities into constant vigilance that generated no economic return while consuming resources communities could barely spare. The necrophages that fed upon corpses found abundant sustenance in the aftermath of the conjunction, as widespread casualties from dimensional rifts, monster attacks, and disease outbreaks created concentrations of dead that overwhelmed traditional burial practices. Ghouls gathered in graveyards and battlefields, growing bold through repeated feeding and eventually attacking living communities when carrion became scarce. The psychological horror of witnessing these creatures desecrating the remains of family members and neighbors proved almost as devastating as direct physical threats, violating cultural practices and religious beliefs fundamental to elder race societies. Attempts to properly dispose of the deceased through cremation or deep burial required time and resources that beleaguered communities often lacked, creating cycles where inadequate handling of casualties attracted additional necrophages that generated more deaths requiring disposal. Trade networks that had connected settlements across the continent collapsed under the weight of accumulated disruptions. Merchants who had reliably traveled established routes for decades found familiar paths infested with monsters, transforming journeys that once posed minimal risk into expeditions requiring substantial armed escorts. The economics of trade shifted dramatically as security costs rose to levels that eliminated profit margins on all but the highest value goods. Settlements that had specialized in particular crafts or agricultural products, relying on trade to obtain necessities they did not produce locally, faced shortages of essential materials. The breakdown of commerce forced communities toward self-sufficiency in all domains, abandoning specialization and efficiency gains that trade had enabled. The loss of knowledge represented perhaps the most devastating long-term consequence of the chaos following the conjunction. Libraries burned during monster raids or conflicts between displaced populations competing for territory. Scholars died before passing accumulated expertise to students, breaking chains of transmission that had preserved techniques and understanding across generations. Institutions dedicated to education and research dissolved as resources necessary for their maintenance became unavailable, and communities prioritized immediate survival over long-term cultural preservation. Entire fields of study disappeared as the last practitioners perished without successors, leaving gaps in collective knowledge that would take centuries to partially restore through painstaking reconstruction from fragmentary sources. The dwarven holds, built deep within mountains and fortified against surface threats, initially appeared better positioned to weather the crisis than settlements relying on wooden palisades or stone walls open to the sky. The underground architecture that characterized dwarven civilization provided natural barriers against many monster species adapted to surface environments. However, the dimensional rifts that opened during the conjunction ignored physical barriers, appearing within sealed chambers as readily as in open fields. Dwarven communities discovered that even their most secure fortifications offered no protection against portals that deposited creatures inside defensive perimeters. Several holds faced catastrophic losses when rifts opened in populated areas, releasing monsters into environments where defenders expected no threats and possessed no prepared response protocols. Elven settlements suffered particularly severe disruptions as the loss of world-walking abilities coincided with monster arrivals and environmental chaos. The elves' relatively low population numbers, previously compensated through access to resources and reinforcements from kindred in other dimensions, became acute vulnerabilities when dimensional isolation eliminated external support. Elven military forces, though individually skilled, lacked numerical superiority necessary for simultaneously defending multiple settlements spread across extensive territories. The strategic doctrine that had guided elven responses to previous crises assumed mobility and flexibility that world-walking enabled, retreating to other dimensions when local conditions deteriorated beyond acceptable thresholds. Trapped on the continent without escape options, elves fought with desperation previously unnecessary, defending territories that represented their only homes rather than merely preferred residences among many possibilities. The gnomish populations, smallest among the elder races and least documented in surviving historical records, apparently suffered disproportionate losses during this period. Evidence suggests that several gnomish communities disappeared entirely, their settlements abandoned or destroyed with no survivors to preserve cultural memory or explain what catastrophe eliminated populations that had endured for generations. The gnomes' technical expertise, while impressive in creating mechanical devices and precision instruments, provided limited utility against supernatural threats that ignored physical laws the devices were designed to manipulate. The specialized knowledge that had made gnomes valuable trading partners became less relevant in an era when survival demanded combat capabilities and agricultural self-sufficiency rather than sophisticated craftsmanship. Halfling communities, relying primarily on agriculture rather than military strength or magical prowess, faced existential threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Monster predation targeted isolated farms and small villages lacking defensive fortifications. The invasion of alien plant and animal species disrupted ecological systems that halfling agriculture depended upon, introducing pests and diseases that devastated crops cultivated through generations of selective breeding adapted to pre-conjunction conditions. Chaos energy saturation affected plant growth in unpredictable ways, causing mutations that rendered some cultivars sterile or toxic while occasionally producing beneficial variations that only partially compensated for losses elsewhere. The halflings' pragmatic adaptability allowed survival where more rigid societies might have collapsed entirely, though at costs measured in abandoned settlements and drastically reduced population numbers. Human populations, arriving as refugees during the conjunction itself, possessed no baseline for comparison with previous conditions on the continent. The Dork and Wasgor cultures encountered a world already transformed by dimensional catastrophe, adapting to monster-infested landscapes and chaos-saturated reality as normal rather than aberrant conditions. This lack of nostalgia for pre-conjunction stability paradoxically provided psychological advantages, as humans invested no emotional energy mourning lost golden ages or attempting to restore conditions they had never experienced. Human settlements developed defensive practices and survival strategies specifically designed for post-conjunction reality rather than adapting techniques developed for different circumstances, occasionally producing innovations that elder races, constrained by traditional approaches, failed to discover. The social fabric that had maintained order within and between communities frayed under relentless stress that offered no respite or recovery periods. Trust eroded as desperate populations competed for scarce resources, with conflicts erupting over territorial boundaries, water sources, and foraging rights in forests suddenly too dangerous for unrestricted access. Refugees fleeing destroyed settlements overwhelmed communities that accepted them, straining hospitality and generating resentment that occasionally erupted into violence. Accusations of collaboration with monsters or responsibility for dimensional rifts provided pretexts for settling old grievances or eliminating rivals, as rational discourse gave way to conspiracy theories and scapegoating. The religious and philosophical frameworks that had provided meaning and structure for elder race societies struggled to accommodate realities that contradicted fundamental assumptions about cosmic order. Theological debates erupted regarding whether the conjunction represented divine punishment, cosmic accident, or deliberate attack by malevolent forces. Traditional rituals and practices designed to maintain harmony with natural cycles seemed irrelevant or even counterproductive in a world where nature itself had been fundamentally altered through dimensional mixing. Some communities abandoned religious observances entirely, concluding that deities who allowed such catastrophes deserved neither worship nor obedience. Others doubled devotional practices, interpreting the conjunction as test of faith requiring renewed commitment to traditional beliefs regardless of apparent evidence against divine benevolence or cosmic justice. The period of acute crisis following the conjunction lasted decades rather than years, extending far beyond what any contemporary observer expected during the initial catastrophe. Each season brought new challenges as monster populations established territories and reproductive cycles. Chaos energy effects manifested in unexpected ways, and accumulated damage to infrastructure and institutions generated cascading failures across interconnected systems. The gradual stabilization of conditions proceeded unevenly across different regions, with some areas returning to relative normalcy within a generation while others remained in crisis states for centuries. The Dark Age that followed the conjunction would fundamentally reshape civilization on the continent, eliminating societies that proved incapable of adaptation while creating opportunities for those who successfully navigated the chaos to claim territories and resources previously held by populations that had not survived the transformation of their world into something unrecognizable from what their ancestors had known. The decades following the conjunction witnessed humanity's gradual discovery that the ambient chaos energy saturating the world could be accessed and manipulated through learned techniques rather than inherited abilities. This realization emerged slowly through observations of elven magical practices, desperate experimentation by individuals seeking any advantage in a monster-infested world, and occasional accidents where untrained attempts at wielding power produced results spectacular enough to demonstrate that possibility existed even if control remained elusive. The development of human chaos magic would prove among the most consequential transformations arising from the conjunction, eventually providing humanity with capabilities that compensated for their physical disadvantages relative to elder races and contributed significantly to their eventual dominance across the continent. The earliest human magic users learned through observation of elven practitioners who had begun adapting their traditional techniques to incorporate manipulation of ambient chaos alongside their innate abilities. Some elves, recognizing potential advantages in sharing knowledge with humans who might become allies rather than competitors, provided instruction to individuals demonstrating unusual sensitivity to magical forces. These teaching relationships remained exceptional rather than common, as most elves viewed human magic users with suspicion or contempt, considering them crude imitators attempting to replicate through study what elves achieved through genetic heritage refined across countless generations. The knowledge transferred during these early collaborations proved fragmentary and incomplete, forcing human practitioners to develop their own theoretical frameworks and practical techniques through trial and error that claimed many lives before producing reliable methods. Human physiology and psychology differed fundamentally from elven characteristics in ways that shaped how each species related to chaos manipulation. Elves possessed natural longevity that allowed centuries of gradual skill refinement, developing mastery through patient accumulation of experience impossible for humans whose lifespans rarely exceeded several decades even under favorable conditions. However, humans demonstrated certain advantages that partially compensated for their shorter study periods. The intensity with which humans approached learning, driven by awareness that limited time demanded efficient use of available years, produced focused dedication that occasionally achieved in decades what might require centuries of more leisurely elven study. Human willingness to accept risks that elves considered unacceptable, born from desperation and limited alternatives, led to discoveries that more cautious practitioners might never attempt. The fundamental principle governing chaos manipulation emerged through observations that remained consistent across different practitioners and techniques. Chaos represented pure potential requiring structure imposed through conscious will to manifest specific effects. A human seeking to generate flame through chaos magic could not simply desire fire and expect results. Rather, they needed to perceive ambient chaos energy, draw it through mental channels developed through training, shape formless potential according to frameworks that combined understanding of combustion physics with mystical principles, and impose sufficient will to overcome reality's resistance to alteration. The complexity of this process meant that even simple magical effects required extensive preparation and mental discipline, while more ambitious workings demanded years of study before safe execution became possible. The costs associated with chaos manipulation proved severe enough to eliminate most aspiring practitioners before they achieved significant capabilities. The principle of equivalent exchange, which required destruction to enable creation, manifested in numerous ways depending on specific techniques and individual physiological responses. Some practitioners discovered that successful magic drained their own vitality, leaving them weakened or aged beyond what their chronological years should produce. Others found that chaos manipulation required sacrificing materials or life forms, converting their essence into the energy necessary for magical effects. The most common consequence among those who survived initial training involved sterility, particularly affecting female practitioners whose reproductive systems proved especially vulnerable to chaos exposure. This side effect would shape magical society profoundly, as sorceresses who emerged from training programs found themselves permanently unable to bear children regardless of their desires or intentions. The physical transformations that accumulated through extended chaos manipulation created visible markers distinguishing experienced practitioners from ordinary humans. Prolonged exposure to chaos energy caused mutations ranging from subtle alterations in eye color or hair texture to more dramatic changes affecting bone structure or organ function. These transformations proceeded gradually across years of practice, often unnoticed by practitioners themselves until comparison with old portraits or reactions from those who had not seen them recently revealed the extent of accumulated changes. The mutations rarely proved debilitating to magical capabilities, though they occasionally generated complications in social contexts where practitioners needed to conceal their status or blend with non-magical populations. The development of human chaos magic occurred independently in multiple regions across the continent, with different communities discovering similar principles through parallel experimentation. This distribution prevented any single school or tradition from claiming exclusive authority over magical knowledge, instead producing diverse approaches reflecting local conditions and cultural assumptions. Some communities emphasized healing applications, developing techniques for transferring vitality from donors to injured or diseased recipients. Others focused on destructive capabilities, crafting methods for channeling chaos into elemental attacks that could supplement conventional weapons in combat against monsters or enemies. The theoretical frameworks justifying these techniques varied significantly, with some traditions emphasizing mystical religious interpretations while others attempted more systematic analysis treating magic as natural phenomenon subject to consistent principles discoverable through experimentation. The elves who had initially shared magical knowledge with humans gradually withdrew from teaching roles as they recognized how rapidly human students progressed and how willing humans proved to pursue applications elves considered ethically questionable or excessively dangerous. The The philosophical differences between species regarding appropriate use of power created tensions that occasionally erupted into conflicts when human practitioners employed techniques elves had explicitly forbidden or warned against. These disputes contributed to deteriorating relations between humans and elder races, adding magical competition to existing tensions over territory and resources. The emergence of human chaos magic attracted attention from individuals across all social classes, though barriers to entry remained substantial. Training required years of dedicated study under guidance from experienced practitioners willing to accept students, creating bottlenecks that limited how many aspiring magic users could receive instruction. The costs associated with training, including materials for experiments and compensation for teachers' time, placed magical education beyond reach for most peasants or laborers struggling to secure basic survival needs. Consequently, early human magic users disproportionately came from merchant families, minor nobility, or urban populations with access to resources and information unavailable in isolated rural communities. The psychological characteristics necessary for successful chaos manipulation proved as important as access to training and resources. Magic required mental discipline sufficient to maintain concentration while perceiving and shaping forces invisible to normal senses, performing complex manipulations while simultaneously maintaining awareness of physical surroundings. Individuals lacking natural aptitude for the cognitive demands of magic, making found training impossibly difficult regardless of motivation or study time invested. This filtering effect meant that successful practitioners represented a small subset of those who attempted magical careers, with a majority either failing to progress beyond basic techniques or perishing during experiments that exceeded their capabilities to control. The social position of early human magic users remained ambiguous, generating responses ranging from reverence to hostility depending on local circumstances and individual behavior. Communities facing constant monster threats valued practitioners who could provide magical assistance in defense or healing, offering them status and resources in exchange for their services. Other settlements viewed magic users with suspicion or fear, concerned that individuals wielding such power might pose threats comparable to the monsters they theoretically helped combat. The visible mutations accumulating through chaos exposure reinforced perceptions of practitioners as fundamentally different from normal humans, marked by their power in ways that set them apart from communities they ostensibly served. The development of chaos magic among humans occurred against backgrounds of ongoing crises that shaped priorities and applications toward practical survival needs rather than purely theoretical study. Magic users who could clear monster infestations from settlements or heal injuries that would otherwise prove fatal found ready employment regardless of social prejudices their mutations or status might generate. Those pursuing magical knowledge primarily for intellectual satisfaction or personal power accumulation faced greater challenges securing resources necessary to continue their studies, as communities with limited surplus had little patience for practitioners who provided no obvious benefits justifying the resources they consumed. The techniques developed during these early decades of human chaos magic would form foundations for institutional magical education that would emerge in subsequent centuries. The practitioners who survived the experimental period and accumulated significant knowledge began accepting students more systematically, creating lineages of training that preserved successful techniques while filtering out approaches proven excessively dangerous or ineffective. These informal schools gradually evolved toward more structured institutions as magical knowledge accumulated and theoretical frameworks became sufficiently developed to support organized curricula. The transformation of magic from desperate experimentation by isolated individuals into organized discipline taught through established academies would take generations to complete, proceeding unevenly across different regions and shaped by local political conditions and cultural attitudes toward mystical power. The rise of chaos magic among humanity represented fundamental shift in power dynamics across the continent. Species that had never before possessed magical abilities suddenly gained access to forces that could match or exceed capabilities the elder races had considered exclusive advantages justifying their dominance. The long-term implications of this transformation would only become fully apparent across subsequent centuries, as human magic users accumulated power and knowledge sufficient to challenge elven hegemony, eventually contributing to reversals of fortune that would see humans ascending to political dominance while elves descended into marginalized minority status in lands their ancestors had ruled for countless generations before the conjunction shattered every certainty and created a world where previous hierarchies meant nothing and survival depended upon adaptation to realities that rewarded different capabilities than those that had ensured success in the world that existed before dimensions collided and chaos flooded through broken boundaries that would never fully heal. The manipulation of chaos energy extracted severe prices from those who sought to wield it, imposing physical and psychological burdens that accumulated across years of practice and eventually transformed practitioners into beings fundamentally different from those who remained uninvolved with magical arts. The principle of equivalent exchange, discovered through painful experience rather than theoretical study, governed every magical working regardless of scale or purpose. Reality maintained balance through mechanisms that transcended conscious understanding, ensuring that creation demanded destruction, that healing required transferring vitality from elsewhere, that any alteration of natural law necessitated payment in forms that could not be negotiated or avoided. The immediate physical cost of channeling chaos manifested during the act of spellcasting itself, as practitioners directed primordial energies through their own bodies and minds to shape effects in the material world. The process resembled allowing lightning to flow through flesh and bone, exposing practitioners to forces that organic tissue had never evolved to withstand. Novice magic users frequently underestimated these dangers, attempting workings beyond their capacity and suffering consequences ranging from temporary exhaustion to permanent injury or immediate death. The sensation of chaos flowing through living channels proved intensely painful, burning along neural pathways and straining cardiovascular systems stressed beyond normal operational parameters. Practitioners learned to build tolerance through gradual exposure, conditioning themselves to withstand energies that would incapacitate or terminate untrained individuals. The principle of exchange required that magical effects draw power from sources beyond the practitioner's will and knowledge. Simple workings might consume the caster's own vitality, leaving them weakened and aged beyond their chronological years. More complex spells demanded external sacrifices, where the materials deliberately gathered for the purpose or energy unconsciously drawn from the surrounding environment. The chaos itself possessed no inherent morality or preference regarding payment sources, extracting whatever proved available and sufficient regardless of whether the practitioner intended or approved the specific sacrifice. This indifference to intent created situations where magic users attempting beneficial workings found themselves inadvertently causing harm through chaos drawing payment from unintended sources. The physical transformations that accumulated through extended chaos exposure proved irreversible once manifested. These changes proceeded gradually, often escaping notice until comparison with portraits or memories revealed how much the practitioner had altered from their original appearance. Eye color might shift toward unnatural hues as pupils dilated permanently or developed reflective qualities resembling certain nocturnal predators. Hair texture transformed, becoming coarser or finer, occasionally developing metallic sheens or phosphorescent properties that glowed faintly in darkness. Skin acquired unusual tones or textures, with some practitioners developing scales, metallic patches, or regions of translucence that revealed underlying structures normally hidden beneath opaque tissue. Sterility emerged as perhaps the most common and personally devastating consequence of chaos manipulation, affecting practitioners of both sexes though manifesting most obviously among sorceresses whose inability to conceive became apparent through years of attempts producing no pregnancies. The mechanisms underlying this effect remained mysterious even to practitioners who studied the phenomenon extensively. Chaos exposure apparently disrupted reproductive systems at fundamental levels, rendering gonads incapable of producing viable gametes or creating hormonal imbalances that prevented successful conception and gestation. For individuals who had anticipated raising families, this consequence proved psychologically traumatic, forcing acceptance that magical careers demanded sacrificing possibilities of biological parenthood. The mental effects of chaos manipulation proved equally profound though more subtle than obvious physical mutations. Extended exposure altered consciousness in ways that made normal human experience increasingly remote and incomprehensible. Practitioners reported sensory perception expanding beyond normal ranges, detecting energies invisible to non-magical individuals, hearing frequencies outside typical auditory limits, perceiving temporal flows that allowed limited precognitive awareness of probable futures. These enhanced perceptions provided advantages in magical contexts while simultaneously alienating practitioners from ordinary social interactions where their expanded awareness registered information others could neither detect nor comprehend, creating communication barriers that deepened with advancing magical skill. Emotional responses transformed through prolonged chaos manipulation in patterns that suggested systematic erosion of effective capacity. Practitioners described emotional experiences becoming muted, requiring more extreme stimuli to generate responses that previously arose from ordinary situations. Joy felt less intense, sorrow lost its acute edge, anger transformed into cold calculation rather than hot passion. This emotional dampening served protective functions, allowing practitioners to perform magical operations requiring concentration undisturbed by effective responses, though it simultaneously created interpersonal difficulties as magic users found themselves incapable of responding appropriately to situations that demanded emotional engagement. Relationships with non-practitioners suffered as partners or family members recognized that the individual they had known had transformed into something fundamentally different. The relationship between chaos exposure and longevity proved paradoxical, with different practitioners experiencing opposite effects from apparently similar practices. Some magic users found their lifespans extended dramatically beyond normal human limits, maintaining physical vigor and mental acuity across decades or centuries while contemporaries aged naturally and perished. Others experienced accelerated aging, their bodies breaking down prematurely under accumulated chaos damage despite chronological ages suggesting they should remain in their prime. The factors determining which outcome occurred remained unclear, possibly depending on specific techniques employed, genetic predispositions, or subtle variations in how individual physiologies responded to chaos exposure. The training necessary to safely manipulate chaos required years of disciplined practice under guidance from experienced practitioners who understood dangers and could intervene when students' attempts generated effects beyond their control. The mortality rate during training periods remained substantial, with estimates suggesting perhaps half of those who began serious magical study perished before achieving sufficient skill to safely execute even basic workings. Many training deaths resulted from students attempting techniques beyond their capacities, misjudging their limitations and initiating workings they lacked strength or knowledge to complete. The chaos summoned during such attempts, finding insufficient control from the practitioner, sought payment through whatever means available, frequently consuming the student entirely. The social isolation that accompanied advancing magical skill proved nearly inevitable regardless of practitioners' desires for maintaining connections to non-magical communities. The physical mutations marking advanced practitioners as visibly different created barriers to casual social interaction, as ordinary people reacted with fear or revulsion to individuals whose appearances violated norms of human morphology. The mental changes that accompanied chaos exposure deepened isolation further, as practitioners found themselves unable to relate to concerns and interests that occupied non-magical individuals. The gulf between those who manipulated chaos and those who remained untouched by direct magical practice widened across the years until practitioners existed in social worlds almost entirely separate from ordinary population, interacting primarily with other magic users who understood experiences incomprehensible to outsiders. The temptations associated with chaos manipulation created ethical challenges that tested every practitioner's moral framework. The power to alter reality according to will, constrained only by knowledge and capacity to withstand costs, enabled actions ranging from beneficial healing to catastrophic destruction. The principle of equivalent exchange imposed no moral judgment on how practitioners chose to employ their capabilities, caring only that appropriate sacrifices accompanied desired effects. Some magic users devoted themselves to beneficial applications, accepting personal costs as prices for helping others through healing or defending communities against threats. Others pursued power for its own sake or employed magic for personal advantage regardless of harm inflicted on others, recognizing that chaos responded equally to benevolent and malevolent intentions provided proper payment accompanied the working. The documentation of chaos manipulation costs remained fragmentary and inconsistent, as practitioners often concealed information about negative effects from rivals or potential students who might reconsider pursuing magical careers if fully informed about likely consequences. The lack of systematic study meant individuals frequently discovered costs through personal experience rather than advance warning, suffering effects that might have been mitigated or avoided entirely through proper preparation. The secrecy surrounding magical practices reflected both competitive impulses between practitioners seeking advantages over rivals and genuine concerns that widespread knowledge about chaos manipulation might enable dangerous applications by individuals lacking proper training or ethical constraints. The cumulative nature of chaos exposure meant that effects built upon each other across years or decades, with initial minor changes setting trajectories toward more profound transformations. A practitioner who accepted minor physical mutations early in their career found those changes progressing toward more extreme states as continued practice accumulated additional exposure. The point at which practitioners might cease magical activity to prevent further transformation proved difficult to identify, as subtle alterations in consciousness made objective self-assessment increasingly challenging. Many magic users continued practicing long past points where cessation might have preserved recognizable humanity, driven by compulsions that mixed genuine vocational dedication with alterations in judgment capacity resulting from accumulated chaos effects on neural structures governing decision-making processes. The realization that chaos manipulation exacted irreversible costs came gradually across generations of practitioners who learned through collective experience that power demanded prices extending far beyond immediate exhaustion or resource expenditure. The transformation of individuals into something neither fully human nor entirely other represented perhaps the ultimate cost, creating populations of magic users who existed at margins of societies they ostensibly served, marked permanently by their choice to channel forces that reshaped them according to principles acknowledging neither human values nor biological limitations, caring only for balance maintained through exchanges that converted possibility into actuality regardless of what. Practitioners sacrificed in the process of becoming beings capable of imposing their will upon reality itself through mastery of primordial chaos that saturated the world following the conjunction's permanent transformation of every certainty previous ages had accepted as immutable law. The centuries following the conjunction of the spheres witnessed the establishment of monster populations across every region of the continent, as creatures that had arrived during the dimensional catastrophe adapted to their new environment and established territories that would persist for generations. The initial chaos of random arrivals through unstable rifts gave way to more stable patterns as monster species found suitable habitats, developed reproductive cycles, and carved out ecological niches within ecosystems still recovering from the disruption of dimensional mixing. This era, which scholars would later term the Age of Monsters, transformed daily existence for every intelligent species inhabiting the continent, forcing adaptations to realities where supernatural threats represented permanent features rather than temporary crises. The necrophages that had fed upon casualties during the conjunction's immediate aftermath established permanent populations in regions where regular supplies of corpses remained available. Ghouls gathered in graveyards throughout the continent, claiming burial grounds as territories they defended against intruders while scavenging fresh interments. These creatures demonstrated intelligence sufficient for basic problem-solving and pack coordination, making them formidable opponents despite lacking the reasoning capacity of truly sapient species. A single ghoul posed manageable threat to armed defenders, though its claws and teeth inflicted wounds that frequently became infected through bacteria harbored in mouths adapted for consuming rotting flesh. Ghoul packs, however, overwhelmed even well-armed groups through coordinated attacks that exploited any gaps in defensive formations. Drowners colonized waterways across the continent, establishing populations in rivers, lakes, and coastal shallows where they ambushed anyone approaching water sources. Communities that had relied upon specific rivers or wells for generations found familiar locations transformed into hazard zones requiring armed escorts for something as basic as collecting drinking water. The economic and social impacts proved severe, as water access represented fundamental necessity that could not simply be abandoned when drowners claimed particular sites. Settlements either invested resources into clearing drowner populations through organized hunts, constructed fortified approaches to water sources, or relocated entirely to regions where drowners remained less numerous or absent. The vampires that had arrived during the conjunction represented perhaps the most complex challenge facing post-conjunction civilizations. Higher vampires possessed intelligence equal to or exceeding that of humans and elder races, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, long-term planning, and ethical reasoning. Individual higher vampires adopted widely varied approaches to coexistence with other intelligent species, with some integrating into communities and controlling their feeding through arrangements that minimized harm, while others treated humans and elder races as prey with no more moral consideration than humans afforded livestock. The difficulty of eliminating higher vampires through conventional means meant that communities often negotiated informal accommodations rather than attempting confrontations likely to produce casualties even if ultimately successful. Lesser vampires, including species like echimaras and catacans, lacked the intelligence and self-control of their higher cousins while retaining formidable combat capabilities and need for sustenance from living beings. These creatures hunted actively rather than negotiating arrangements, treating settlements as feeding grounds to be raided when hunger demanded. The frequency of vampire attacks varied by region and season, with some areas experiencing raids monthly while others remained relatively undisturbed for years before sudden outbreaks. The unpredictability of vampire activity complicated defensive planning, as communities could not maintain constant readiness for threats that appeared sporadically according to patterns that defied prediction. Cursed ones emerged as ongoing threats distinct from creatures that had simply arrived from other dimensions. Lycanthropy spread through wounds inflicted by infected individuals, creating chains of transmission that periodically produced outbreaks when multiple people contracted the curse simultaneously. Those afflicted with werewolf curses experienced forced transformations during full moon periods, losing conscious control and reverting to predatory instinct that targeted anyone nearby regardless of prior relationships. Communities developed protocols for managing known lycanthropes, ranging from secure confinement during vulnerable periods to permanent exile or execution of individuals considered too dangerous to accommodate. The ethical dimensions of these responses generated ongoing debates regarding responsibility and punishment for actions committed while transformed. The draconids that inhabited mountain regions and certain lowland territories demonstrated territorial behaviors that brought them into conflict with settlements established in or near their claimed domains. Wyverns, while lacking the intelligence of true dragons, possessed aerial mobility and venomous attacks that made them dangerous predators capable of decimating livestock and threatening anyone who entered their territories. Forktails exhibited similar patterns, claiming stretches of coastline or riverside regions as hunting grounds they defended against intrusion. The economic impact of draconid territories proved substantial, as communities avoided establishing settlements or infrastructure in regions where draconids maintained active presence, ceding potentially valuable land to creatures that could not be easily displaced. True dragons, rare even before the conjunction, became subjects of legend rather than regular threats during this period. These beings possessed intelligence exceeding most other species, demonstrated command of chaos magic rivaling skilled human practitioners, and exhibited lifespans measured in centuries or millennia. Individual dragons occasionally intervened in affairs of other species according to motivations that remained opaque to those affected by their actions. The unpredictability of dragon behavior, combined with their formidable capabilities, meant that communities generally avoided provoking them while maintaining awareness that dragon territories represented zones to be avoided or traversed with extreme caution. The ecological disruptions caused by monster populations extended beyond direct predation to affect entire biological systems. Invasive species from other dimensions competed with native organisms for resources, occasionally driving local species toward extinction when competition proved too severe. Monsters whose waste products contained compounds toxic in the continent's biochemistry contaminated water and soil in regions where they maintained high population densities. The cumulative effects of these disruptions transformed landscapes, rendering previously fertile agricultural zones unsuitable for cultivation and forcing communities to abandon settlements that could no longer support resident populations. The economic burden of defending against monsters consumed resources that might otherwise have been directed toward productive activities or cultural development. Settlements maintained armed forces substantially larger than would have been necessary for conflicts with other intelligent species alone, diverting labor from agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade into perpetual military readiness. The costs of weapons, armor, and fortifications suitable for monster defense exceeded expenses for conventional military equipment, as creatures resistant to normal weapons required silver, specialized alloys, or magical enhancements to inflict reliable harm. Trade caravans required armed escorts numerous enough to deter or defeat monster attacks, raising transportation costs and making certain commerce economically unviable when security expenses exceeded potential profits. The psychological burden of living under constant threat from supernatural predators proved as significant as material costs. Parents raised children in environments where venturing beyond defensive perimeters might result in encounters with creatures capable of ending lives before assistance could arrive. The night transformed from merely inconvenient darkness into a period of acute danger when many monster species demonstrated peak activity, forcing communities to implement curfews and maintain constant watches. The accumulated stress of perpetual vigilance contributed to social tensions, as populations under constant pressure proved more prone to conflicts over resources, status, and the numerous small frictions that peaceful prosperity might have rendered manageable. The attempts by various species to develop effective responses to monster threats produced innovations ranging from specialized weapons to tactical doctrines designed for non-human adversaries. Hunters who specialized in particular monster types accumulated knowledge regarding behavioral patterns, vulnerabilities, and optimal approaches for eliminating or deterring specific species. This expertise, transmitted through apprenticeship and occasionally documented in bestiaries that catalogued monster characteristics, represented crucial survival knowledge for communities facing ongoing threats. The most successful hunters commanded substantial fees for their services, as settlements desperate to eliminate monster infestations proved willing to pay premium rates for expertise that conventional soldiers lacked. The recognition that conventional military forces proved inadequate for addressing monster threats would eventually drive desperate measures that transformed certain individuals into beings specifically designed for hunting supernatural predators. The concept of creating enhanced hunters through alchemical mutation remained decades or centuries in the future during the height of the Age of Monsters, requiring accumulation of knowledge regarding both monster biology and chaos manipulation techniques necessary for implementing transformative processes. The centuries when monsters dominated vast regions of the continent, reducing civilized territories to fortified enclaves surrounded by wilderness too dangerous for settlement, would shape collective memory across all species, creating cultural assumptions and social structures that would persist long after witches eventually reduced monster populations to levels where ordinary travel and commerce could resume in relative safety throughout most of the continent. Approximately 760 to 830 years after the conjunction of the sphere's first shattered dimensional boundaries and deposited humans among other refugees and monsters on the continent, a second wave of human migration occurred under circumstances that remain among the most mysterious events in recorded history. The landing of exiles, as this arrival came to be known, brought populations far exceeding the scattered communities of Dork and Wasgore who had preceded them by centuries. These newcomers, who would become known as Nordlings to distinguish them from earlier human inhabitants and later southern populations, arrived by sea in vessels whose origins and construction techniques suggested technological capabilities different from anything the continent had previously witnessed. The exact geographic location where the Nordling fleets made landfall remains disputed among scholars examining fragmentary historical records and oral traditions preserved across generations. Coastal regions throughout the Northern Territories claim association with the landing, each presenting archaeological or documentary evidence supporting their assertions. The lack of definitive records reflects both the chaos surrounding the arrival itself and the subsequent dispersal of Nordling populations across vast territories during following decades. The refugees who disembarked from their vessels appeared to possess limited written documentation of their origins, suggesting either loss of records during whatever catastrophe prompted their departure or cultural practices that privileged oral transmission over textual preservation. The mystery surrounding where the Nordlings originated before reaching the continent has generated speculation ranging from scholarly theories grounded in linguistic and cultural analysis to fantastic legends claiming supernatural or dimensional sources. The refugees themselves apparently provided contradictory or incomplete accounts regarding their homelands, perhaps reflecting origins from multiple regions or spheres that had been forced together during migration. Linguistic evidence suggests relationships between Nordling languages and certain Elder speech dialects, though the connections remain sufficiently distant to indicate either very ancient divergence or parallel development in separate populations. The technological capabilities demonstrated by Nordling vessels and equipment indicated sophisticated metallurgy and engineering knowledge, suggesting origin in civilizations that had achieved substantial development before whatever catastrophe prompted mass evacuation. The initial encounters between Nordlings and the continent's established inhabitants proceeded with surprising lack of major conflict, despite historical patterns suggesting that contact between populations competing for territory typically generated hostility. Several factors may have contributed to this relatively peaceful initial period. The Nordlings arrived in numbers sufficient to defend themselves effectively against potential aggressors, yet apparently lacked immediate territorial ambitions requiring displacement of existing settlements. The elder races, still recovering from the upheavals following the conjunction and occupied with ongoing monster threats, may have calculated that peaceful accommodation served their interests better than conflicts that would drain military resources. The earlier arrival of Dork and Wasgor populations had established precedent for human presence, making Nordling refugees seem less dramatically foreign than they might have appeared otherwise. The demographic characteristics of Nordling populations differed significantly from the Dork and Wasgor cultures that had preceded them. The refugees who disembarked from the landing fleets included individuals representing broad ranges of ages, skills, and social positions, suggesting organized evacuation of complete communities rather than selective migration of particular groups. The presence of craftspeople, merchants, scholars, and religious functionaries alongside farmers and laborists indicated that Nordlings derived from complex societies rather than primitive communities lacking social differentiation. This diversity of expertise and knowledge would prove crucial in enabling rapid establishment of permanent settlements and economic systems capable of supporting substantial populations. The Nordlings brought with them cultural practices, technological knowledge, and social structures that would fundamentally shape the development of northern human civilization across subsequent centuries. Their legal traditions, derived from whatever societies they had departed, provided frameworks for organizing communities, resolving disputes, and establishing governmental authorities that combined efficiency with flexibility sufficient to accommodate varying local conditions. Their religious beliefs, centered on deities whose names and characteristics suggested Indo-European origins, though specific details varied across different Nordling subgroups, provided shared cultural touchstones that facilitated cooperation among communities that might otherwise have remained isolated by geographic distance or resource competition. The rate at which Nordling populations expanded across the northern continent exceeded anything the elder races had previously witnessed among human communities. Within a generation of the landing, Nordling settlements extended hundreds of miles from initial coastal footholds, establishing agricultural villages and trading posts in territories that had remained wilderness or supported only sparse populations of elder races. The reproductive rate that characterized human populations generally manifested particularly strongly among Nordlings whose cultural values apparently encouraged large families and early marriage ages. The combination of high birth rates with relatively low mortality through technological advantages and communal mutual support systems created exponential population growth that transformed demographic balances across regions where Nordlings settled. The technological capabilities the Nordlings brought from their mysterious origins provided significant advantages in establishing new settlements and defending against monster threats. Their metallurgical knowledge allowed production of weapons and armor superior to equipment available to earlier human populations, though still generally inferior to dwarven craftsmanship refined across centuries. Their agricultural techniques, developed in whatever homeland they had departed, proved adaptable to continent conditions after modest modifications, enabling food production sufficient to support growing populations. Their architectural knowledge allowed construction of defensive fortifications combining effectiveness against monster attacks with efficiency in resource utilization, permitting establishment of permanent settlements in regions where earlier attempts had failed due to inadequate protection. The relationship between Nordling newcomers and the earlier Dork and Wasgor human populations remains poorly documented, though evidence suggests complex patterns ranging from peaceful integration to violent displacement depending on local circumstances. Some Dork and Wasgor communities apparently welcomed Nordling arrivals, recognizing advantages in cooperation with populations possessing superior numbers and technological capabilities. Intermarriage between earlier and later human groups created mixed communities that combined cultural elements from both sources. Other regions witnessed conflicts as Nordlings claimed territories that Dork or Wasgor groups considered their established domains, with outcomes typically favoring the more numerous and better-equipped Nordling populations. The elder races observed Nordling expansion with responses ranging from cautious welcome to growing alarm as they recognized implications of unchecked human population growth. Dwarven holds, secure in their mountain fortifications and occupied primarily with territories humans showed limited interest in settling, maintained generally cordial relations with Nordling communities and engaged in mutually beneficial trade. Elven populations, more directly threatened by human expansion into forested territories they considered their traditional domains, adopted more hostile postures that would eventually escalate into armed conflicts as competition for land intensified. Halfling communities, lacking military power to resist human expansion yet possessing agricultural expertise that humans valued, generally accommodated Nordling settlement while maintaining distinct cultural identities. The emergence of distinct Nordling regional cultures occurred rapidly as populations dispersed across varied geographic and political environments. Communities that settled in different territories developed separate identities reflecting local conditions, relationships with elder race neighbors, and decisions by early leaders whose choices established precedents that subsequent generations maintained through cultural inertia. The foundations for what would eventually become the northern kingdoms of Redania, Temeria, Cadwyn, and Aedirn emerged during this period, though formal kingdom establishment would await later generations when populations and territorial control reached levels justifying centralized political organization. The mysterious nature of what catastrophe or motivation prompted the Nordling exodus from their original homeland remains one of history's most tantalizing unsolved questions. The refugees themselves apparently provided no detailed accounts, whether through deliberate silence regarding traumatic experiences, cultural prohibitions against discussing certain subjects, or simply because their descendants gradually forgot details their ancestors had once known. Later generations of Nordling-descended humans showed little interest in investigating their origins, focusing instead on practical concerns of survival and expansion in their new homeland. The landing of exiles thus remained a foundational mystery, an event whose consequences shaped the continent's entire subsequent history yet whose causes disappeared into obscurity, leaving only the legacy of transformed demographics and cultural landscapes that would ultimately enable human ascension to political dominance across territories that had belonged to elder races for centuries before any human had ever set foot upon the continent's shores. The centuries following the landing of exiles witnessed demographic transformation that would permanently alter the balance of power across the continent, as Nordling populations expanded at rates that overwhelmed the elder race's capacity to resist through military force or diplomatic negotiation. The reproductive advantages inherent to human biology, combined with cultural practices that encouraged large families and social structures supporting rapid community formation, generated population growth that proceeded exponentially rather than linearly. Within mere generations, Human settlements dotted landscapes that had remained wilderness or supported only sparse populations of dwarfs, elves, and halflings for centuries before any human had arrived. The rapidity of human expansion caught elder races unprepared for its scale and consequences. Elven populations, accustomed to thinking in terms of centuries due to their extended lifespans, failed to recognize the urgency of addressing human demographic growth until territories they considered permanently secured came under pressure from settlements establishing themselves without seeking permission or acknowledging prior claims. The elves' low reproductive rates, which had previously seemed adequate for maintaining stable populations across territories they controlled, proved catastrophically insufficient when competing against species capable of doubling populations within single generations. Individual elves might live centuries, accumulating vast knowledge and experience, yet found themselves increasingly outnumbered by humans whose shorter lifespans drove cultural changes and technological adaptations far more rapidly than elven society could match. The establishment of permanent human kingdoms transformed political landscapes that had remained relatively stable for centuries under elder race dominance. The Kingdom of Redania emerged in northern territories, consolidating previously scattered human settlements under centralized authority capable of coordinating defense, regulating trade, and asserting sovereignty over defined geographic regions. Temeria coalesced in central lands, claiming fertile river valleys and strategic crossroads that would make it among the wealthiest and most influential of the northern kingdoms. Cadwyn established itself in mountainous northern regions, its population developing martial traditions and hierarchical social structures reflecting constant conflicts with monsters inhabiting surrounding wilderness. Aedirn formed in eastern territories, building prosperity through agriculture and trade while maintaining military capabilities sufficient to defend against various threats. The process through which these kingdoms emerged involved conquest as frequently as peaceful consolidation, with stronger communities absorbing weaker neighbors through combination of military pressure and economic incentives. Human warlords who demonstrated successful leadership in defending against monsters or defeating rival communities gathered followings that evolved into permanent political structures. The establishment of hereditary monarchies, where leadership passed through family lines rather than being contested by each generation, provided stability that enabled long-term planning and institutional development impossible under systems requiring constant leadership challenges. The kingdoms that emerged from this tumultuous period possess governmental structures sophisticated enough to coordinate activities across vast territories while maintaining sufficient flexibility to accommodate regional variations in culture and custom. The expansion of human kingdoms inevitably brought conflicts with elder races who had occupied territories for centuries before human arrival. Elven forests that had remained untouched by previous inhabitants became targets for human logging operations seeking timber for construction and fuel. Agricultural settlements cleared land that elves considered sacred or culturally significant, destroying ancient groves and disrupting ecosystems that had existed undisturbed for millennia. Human hunters pursued game in territories elves had managed as private reserves, depleting animal populations and disrupting traditional elven subsistence patterns. These encroachments proceeded gradually initially, individual incidents that might have been negotiated or resolved through local accommodations, then accelerated as human populations grew and land hunger intensified. The military conflicts that erupted between expanding human kingdoms and defending elder race populations demonstrated brutal efficiency of human tactical adaptations developed specifically for conquest rather than mere defense. Where elder races had focused military development on monster threats and occasional skirmishes with each other, humans created armies designed for sustained campaigns against intelligent adversaries capable of strategic coordination. The shorter human lifespans created cultures where martial glory achieved within compressed time frames held greater value than elven approaches emphasizing patient accumulation of advantage across decades. Human commanders demonstrated willingness to accept casualty rates that elves, with their slow reproductive cycles, could never sustain without facing population collapse. The extinction of the earlier Dork and Wasgor cultures occurred during this period of rapid Nordling expansion, though exact circumstances remain poorly documented. These populations, which had arrived during the conjunction itself and maintained distinct identities for centuries, apparently disappeared through combination of absorption into dominant Nordling culture and outright displacement from territories they had occupied. The linguistic and cultural elements that distinguished Dork and Wasgor from Nordlings vanished within generations, leaving only fragmentary archaeological evidence and occasional loanwords preserved in regional dialects. The ease with which these earlier human cultures disappeared suggested that Nordling numerical superiority rendered previous inhabitants culturally and demographically irrelevant once population ratios shifted sufficiently toward newcomers. Dwarven populations adapted to human expansion more successfully than elves, primarily through focusing on territories humans found less desirable and emphasizing economic relationships that made dwarven communities valuable trading partners rather than competitors for land. The mountain holds that dwarfs preferred for settlement held limited attraction for human agricultural communities, and dwarven expertise in mining and metallurgy produced goods humans eagerly purchased rather than attempting to produce themselves. Individual dwarfs integrated into human communities with relative ease, their physical differences proving less dramatic than elven characteristics and their practical skills generating respect that partially offset prejudices their non-human status inspired. The accommodations dwarfs reached with expanding human kingdoms allowed them to maintain cultural identity and substantial autonomy within their traditional territories while accepting human political dominance in broader regional contexts. Halfling communities survived human expansion through similar strategies of occupying ecological niches humans valued less intensely and providing specialized services that made them economically valuable. The halflings' focus on agriculture and their contentment with modest territorial holdings meant they posed no threat to human kingdoms' expansionist ambitions. Their smaller physical size and generally peaceful dispositions made them seem less threatening than elves whose martial traditions and proud demeanor generated conflicts even when material interests might have been negotiated. Halflings who lived in human-dominated regions accepted subordinate social positions that allowed them to maintain distinct cultural practices while avoiding conflicts their limited numbers and military capabilities could not have won. The transformation of political geography proceeded with remarkable speed by elder race standards, though the process consumed generations from human perspectives. Territories that had been wilderness, elven forests, or contested borderlands became core regions of human kingdoms, their previous histories obscured or forgotten as human settlements established themselves as permanent features. The roads that connected human communities, the fortifications that defended strategic locations, the agricultural systems that fed growing populations, all represented investments that made human presence increasingly difficult to challenge or reverse even had elder races possessed military capabilities for reconquest. The cultural confidence that accompanied human political dominance manifested in attitudes toward elder races that ranged from paternalistic condescension to outright hostility. Humans who had grown up in kingdoms established by their grandparents considered themselves native inhabitants with greater legitimacy than elves whose ancestors had occupied the same territories for centuries before any human arrived. The irony of refugees and descendants of refugees claiming indigenous status while treating actual long-term inhabitants as alien intruders apparently escaped human populations whose historical memory rarely extended beyond a few generations. The prejudices that developed during this period, treating elder races as backward remnants of primitive eras superseded by human progress, would persist for centuries and contribute to ongoing tensions that periodically erupted into violence. The speed and thoroughness of human demographic expansion represented perhaps the most consequential long-term effect of the conjunction of the spheres beyond the immediate catastrophe of dimensional collapse. The refugees who had arrived through unstable portals, primitive and powerless compared to established elder race civilizations, had within mere centuries transformed themselves into the continent's dominant species through reproductive success that overwhelmed every other consideration. The kingdoms they established would shape political structures for all subsequent history, creating institutions and cultural patterns that would define civilization across the northern realms long after the circumstances that had enabled their rise faded into historical obscurity, leaving only the legacy of transformed demographics and power relationships that saw humans' ascendant and elder races reduced to minority populations within territories that had once belonged to them without question or challenge. Approximately 900 years after the conjunction of the spheres first deposited monsters across the continent, human kingdoms faced an existential crisis that conventional military forces proved incapable of resolving. Monster populations had stabilized at levels that made large regions effectively uninhabitable, with trade routes frequently disrupted by attacks and remote settlements facing gradual abandonment as casualties exceeded population replacement rates. The economic and social costs of perpetual defensive warfare against supernatural predators strained kingdoms to breaking points, threatening regression into fragmented communities incapable of maintaining the civilizational advances achieved since the landing of exiles. In this desperate context, kings and their advisors contemplated measures that would have seemed unthinkable under less dire circumstances, seeking solutions that combined human ingenuity with the chaos magic that humans had learned to manipulate across preceding centuries. The collaboration between monarchs and mags that would eventually produce witches began with straightforward objectives: create enhanced hunters capable of combating monsters with efficiency exceeding what conventional soldiers could achieve. The mags involved in these early experiments possessed extensive knowledge of chaos manipulation, understanding how mystical energies could reshape living tissue and alter fundamental biological processes. They had observed how prolonged chaos exposure mutated practitioners, sometimes generating beneficial adaptations alongside harmful effects. The theoretical possibility existed that controlled chaos manipulation, combined with alchemical preparations derived from monster biology, might produce deliberate mutations that enhanced combat capabilities while minimizing detrimental consequences. The practical execution of this theory would prove far more challenging than initial planning anticipated. The first experimental subjects consisted of adult volunteers, soldiers who accepted substantial payments in exchange for undergoing procedures whose outcomes remained uncertain. The mags applied alchemical mutagens designed to trigger controlled transformations, attempting to enhance strength, speed, sensory acuity, and resistance to injury while maintaining cognitive function and emotional stability. These initial trials produced catastrophic failures with depressing consistency. Adult physiologies, already fully developed and stable, resisted the radical transformations that mutagens attempted to impose. The chaos energy required to force changes through established biological patterns proved overwhelming to subjects whose bodies and minds had no capacity for adapting to such extreme stresses. Most volunteers perished during the transformation process itself, their systems failing under the cascade of physiological disruptions that mutagens triggered. Those few who survived emerged so profoundly damaged, physically and mentally, that they represented failures rather than viable prototypes for enhanced hunters. The recognition that adult subjects could not withstand transformation processes led to controversial decision to experiment on children instead. The mags reasoned that younger physiologies, still developing and more plastic than mature adults, might better accommodate the radical changes that creating enhanced hunters required. Children's bodies had not yet settled into fixed patterns, suggesting they might accept mutations that would overwhelm adult systems. The ethical implications of subjecting children to procedures that had proven universally fatal or catastrophically damaging when applied to adults generated intense debates, though desperation ultimately overrode moral objections. Kings who had sanctioned the experiments found their positions politically untenable when reports of children perishing in alchemical laboratories reached broader populations, generating public outrage that forced monarchs to officially condemn the experiments and banish participating mags from their kingdoms. The official prohibitions against continued experimentation proved ineffective in preventing dedicated mags from pursuing research they believed necessary for addressing monster threats. Those practitioners who had committed substantial time and resources to developing transformation techniques withdrew to remote locations beyond royal authority, continuing experiments using subjects acquired through means ranging from payments to desperate parents to outright abduction. The research proceeded in secret, funded through private wealth accumulated by mags or financial support from nobles who recognized potential value in enhanced hunters regardless of ethical costs involved in their creation. The work that occurred during this clandestine phase would eventually produce breakthroughs that made viable witches possible. The techniques that finally achieved success, after decades of failed experiments and countless deaths, combined multiple elements refined through bitter experience. The mutagens themselves, alchemical preparations incorporating distilled essences from various monster species, required precise formulations that balanced potency against toxicity. Too weak and they failed to trigger necessary transformations. Too strong and they proved immediately fatal. The trials of the grasses, as the transformation process came to be termed, involved administering these mutagens in specific sequences while subjects underwent additional procedures designed to support their bodies through the traumatic changes. The timing of interventions proved crucial, with optimal results achieved when subjects reached particular developmental stages, typically early adolescence when physical growth accelerated yet fundamental systems retained sufficient plasticity for accepting radical alterations. The mortality rate remained devastating even after techniques improved beyond catastrophic initial failures. Estimates suggest perhaps 3 in 10 children survived the trials, though survival rates varied depending on specific techniques employed by different practitioners and individual physiological characteristics that made some subjects more resilient than others. The transformation process inflicted excruciating pain as mutagens restructured cellular processes and chaos energy forced physiological systems into configurations evolution had never produced. Those who survived emerged fundamentally changed in ways that set them apart from baseline humanity as dramatically as mutations distinguished chaos-touched mags from ordinary people. The enhancements that successful transformation produced justified, from purely pragmatic perspectives, the horrific costs the process demanded. Witches demonstrated reflexes exceeding human norms by substantial margins, allowing them to react to threats with speed that made them nearly impossible for normal humans to strike in combat. Their strength increased proportionally, enabling them to wield weapons and sustain exertion levels that would exhaust or injure unmutated individuals. Sensory perception expanded across multiple modalities, with vision capable of functioning in near darkness, hearing sensitive enough to detect sounds beyond normal human range, and olfactory capabilities allowing tracking through scent trails days old. The witches' bodies processed toxins and poisons far more efficiently than baseline human physiology, rendering them resistant to substances that would prove debilitating or fatal to others. Their lifespans extended dramatically, with properly made witches potentially living centuries while maintaining physical capabilities that would deteriorate in normal humans after mere decades. The mutations produced side effects that proved inevitable regardless of refinements in transformation techniques. Sterility afflicted all witches, male and female, rendering them permanently incapable of biological reproduction. The emotional capacity that characterized normal human experience became muted, with witches reporting affective responses that felt distant or intellectually recognized rather than deeply experienced. Their pupils developed cat-like appearance, contracting to slits in bright light and reflecting ambient illumination in darkness in ways that marked them as visibly non-human. Additional mutations manifested unpredictably across individuals, with some developing unusual hair colors, altered skin tones, or other distinctive characteristics that varied according to specific mutagens employed and individual physiological responses to transformation. The training that accompanied physiological transformation proved nearly as brutal as the trials themselves. Children who survived mutations required years of instruction in combat techniques, monster lore, survival skills, and the specialized knowledge necessary for functioning as itinerant hunters. The schools that developed for witcher training established themselves in remote locations, isolating students from normal society while subjecting them to regimens that would have broken untransformed individuals. The physical conditioning necessary for witches to fully utilize their enhanced capabilities required exercises that pushed mutated physiology to its limits. The combat training emphasized techniques adapted specifically for fighting monsters rather than human opponents, teaching approaches that exploited creature vulnerabilities while maintaining defense against attacks capable of ending even enhanced lives. The education in monster behavior, habitat preferences, and identifying characteristics created encyclopedic knowledge that allowed witches to assess threats and develop appropriate countermeasures. The establishment of multiple witcher schools reflected both practical considerations regarding training capacity and philosophical differences among founders regarding optimal approaches to creating and deploying enhanced hunters. The School of the Wolf, which would establish its headquarters at Kaer Morhen, developed reputation for producing balanced witches who combined combat prowess with judicious application of force and willingness to interact with human communities. Other schools including the Cat, Bear, Griffin, and viper emphasized different characteristics, producing witches whose combat styles, ethical frameworks, and relationships with broader society reflected distinct training philosophies. The competition and occasional hostility between schools sometimes erupted into direct conflicts, with witches from different traditions treating each other as rivals rather than fellow members of shared profession. The creation of witches represented humanity's willingness to sacrifice children in pursuit of solutions to problems conventional approaches could not resolve. The mags and monarchs who sanctioned these experiments, whether officially or through tacit approval of clandestine research, accepted moral costs that would haunt subsequent generations even as they benefited from monster hunting services the transformed children eventually provided. The witches themselves, stripped of reproductive capacity and emotional wholeness, made perpetually other through visible mutations that prevented true integration into societies they ostensibly served, bore permanent personal costs for enhancements they had never chosen and transformations they had endured during childhoods that offered no genuine consent to procedures that would define their entire existences. The transformation of witcher creation from catastrophic experiment to repeatable process, however brutal, required decades of refinement by mags dedicated to solving problems that had claimed hundreds of young males' lives during initial attempts. The work proceeded in secrecy, conducted by practitioners who had withdrawn to remote fortresses beyond the reach of royal authorities who had officially condemned such experimentation. These mags pursued their research with single-minded determination, driven by conviction that monster threats justified extreme measures and by intellectual pride that refused to accept defeat after investing years in developing transformation techniques. The accumulation of knowledge purchased through countless failures would eventually produce methods capable of reliably creating enhanced hunters, though at costs that remained horrifying even after technical problems had been resolved. The trials of the grasses, the term that emerged for the successful transformation process, represented synthesis of alchemical preparation, mystical manipulation, and surgical intervention coordinated across multiple stages. The mutagens themselves required extraordinary precision in formulation, combining essences extracted from various monster species according to ratios determined through experiments that had consumed years identifying which combinations produced desired effects versus those generating fatal toxicity. The extraction processes demanded harvesting specific tissues from monsters at particular developmental stages, preserving biological activity through alchemical stabilization, then distilling active compounds while removing substances that produced unintended side effects. The complexity of creating viable mutagens meant that each batch required substantial investment in materials and expertise, making the transformation process expensive enough to limit how many witches could be created regardless of demand for their services. The timing of when subjects underwent the trials proved crucial to survival rates and quality of results. Children too young lacked physiological resilience necessary for surviving the radical transformations, while adolescents past certain developmental thresholds demonstrated resistance patterns similar to adults, greatly reducing mutation success. The optimal window appeared to occur during early to mid-adolescence, when bodies experienced rapid growth that made them more receptive to imposed changes, yet subjects possessed sufficient physical development to withstand the extreme stresses transformation imposed. The identification of this narrow optimal period meant that witcher schools needed to recruit children years before they could undergo trials, maintaining them through extended preparatory periods that consumed resources while generating no immediate return on investment. The preparatory training that preceded actual mutation served multiple purposes beyond simply occupying candidates during years before they reached appropriate age for trials. The physical conditioning developed baseline fitness that improved candidates' chances of surviving transformation process itself, strengthening cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems that would endure extreme stress during mutation. The combat instruction introduced techniques that would become foundation for later advanced training, allowing students who survived trials to build upon established foundations rather than learning entirely new skills while adapting to radically altered physiology. The mental discipline cultivated through meditation and focus exercises prepared candidates for psychological challenges they would face during and after transformation, developing resilience that would prove essential when confronting mutations that altered their very identities. The actual administration of mutagens occurred across multiple sessions rather than single massive dose, with each stage building upon changes initiated by previous applications. The sequencing of different mutagen types proved as important as their individual formulations, as certain transformations needed to establish themselves before subsequent modifications could be safely introduced. The early stages typically focused on enhancing metabolic efficiency and cellular regeneration capabilities, creating foundations that would support later more dramatic alterations. Middle stages introduced changes to sensory systems, nervous tissue, and muscular structures, reshaping fundamental aspects of physiology that defined how subjects perceived and interacted with their environment. Final stages refined earlier transformations and integrated various mutations into coherent systems capable of functioning reliably under combat stress. The pain associated with transformation exceeded anything that normal human experience encompassed, as mutagens forced cellular structures to reorganize and tissues to adopt configurations that evolution had never produced. The subjects remained conscious throughout much of the process, unable to escape awareness of their bodies remaking themselves according to principles imposed by alchemical forces. The psychological trauma of experiencing such radical involuntary transformation produced lasting effects even in those who survived physically intact, contributing to emotional dampening that characterized Witcher psychology. The screaming that emanated from transformation chambers became infamous enough that Witcher schools established their facilities in remote locations partly to avoid disturbing nearby populations and partly to prevent witnesses who might attempt to interfere based on humanitarian concerns about suffering inflicted on young males. The mortality rate that persisted even after techniques had been refined meant that Witcher schools faced constant need to recruit new candidates to replace those lost during trials. The schools developed various methods for obtaining subjects, ranging from purchasing them from impoverished parents desperate for coin, to accepting orphans who had no other prospects, to claiming children through the law of surprise, a tradition where individuals saved by witches might later be required to surrender children conceived but not yet born at the time of rescue. The ethical problems inherent in these recruitment methods generated ongoing controversy, as critics argued that no child could meaningfully consent to undergoing procedures that would transform them permanently into something neither fully human nor monster while serving purposes they could not understand at ages when most became candidates. The schools that emerged as distinct institutions reflected both practical considerations regarding geographic distribution of facilities and philosophical disagreements among founders regarding optimal approaches to creating and training witches. The School of the Wolf, headquartered at Kaer Morhen in the Blue Mountains, developed reputation for producing balanced witches who combined combat prowess with restraint and maintained functional relationships with human communities despite mutations marking them as other. The training regimen at Kaer Morhen emphasized adaptability and independent judgment, preparing witches for careers spent traveling continuously rather than serving single patrons or regions. The Wolf School witches, including eventually Geralt of Rivia, would become perhaps most recognized practitioners of the profession despite representing only one tradition among several. The School of the Cat pursued different priorities, creating witches who specialized in speed and precision rather than raw strength, favoring techniques that emphasized acrobatic mobility and surgical strikes over sustained combat. The Cat School's willingness to accept contracts involving humans rather than restricting themselves to monster hunting generated criticism from other traditions who viewed such work as undermining witches' ostensible purpose and contributing to negative public perceptions of the profession generally. The mutations employed by Cat School mags apparently produced more pronounced emotional instability than other traditions' techniques, with cat witches demonstrating volatility that occasionally manifested in erratic behavior or outright violent episodes. The School of the Bear, operating from Hen Caddock in the Amel Mountains, focused on creating exceptionally durable witches capable of withstanding tremendous punishment while dealing devastating damage through sheer force. The Bear School training emphasized endurance and straightforward tactics, producing witches who approached combat through overwhelming power rather than finesse or deception. The Bear Witches' substantial size and intimidating presence served them well in certain contexts, though made integration into civilian society more challenging than smaller schools' graduates experienced. The school of the Griffin distinguished itself through emphasizing magical training alongside martial prowess, producing witches who demonstrated unusual facility with signs, the limited chaos manipulation techniques that mutations granted access to alongside physical enhancements. The Griffin school's philosophical framework stressed monster hunting as noble calling rather than mere profession, encouraging witches to view themselves as protectors of civilization rather than mercenaries selling specialized services. This idealistic approach generated both admiration from communities that appreciated Griffin witches' dedication and criticism from other schools who viewed such attitudes as naive given harsh realities of how society actually treated mutants regardless of their intentions or actions. The School of the Viper, about which relatively little reliable information survived, apparently operated in distant eastern regions and developed techniques optimized for stealth and the use of toxins. The Viper Witches gained notorious reputations for accepting contracts other schools refused and employing methods that prioritized efficiency over honor or restraint. The eventual destruction of the Viper School, circumstances of which remained poorly documented, eliminated this tradition, though its techniques apparently survived through scattered survivors who continued practicing in isolation or occasionally training individual students in methods that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The perfection of witcher creation techniques, to the extent that such brutal processes could ever be considered perfected, represented triumph of pragmatic necessity over ethical restraint. The mags who developed reliable transformation methods had solved extraordinary technical challenges, creating procedures that reliably produced enhanced humans capable of combating supernatural threats conventional approaches could not address. The costs measured in children who perished during experiments that refined techniques, in permanent transformations inflicted on those who survived, and in psychological and physical burdens witches carried throughout extended lifespans, received less emphasis than practical results achieved through application of knowledge earned through suffering that practitioners viewed as regrettable necessities rather than preventable tragedies deserving fundamental reconsideration of whether goals justified means employed in their pursuit. The position witches occupied within broader society reflected contradictions that defined their existence from creation through their eventual decline. Communities needed the services enhanced hunters provided, facing monster threats that conventional forces could not adequately address, yet simultaneously despised the mutants whose visible differences marked them as other regardless of benefits their work generated. This paradox shaped every aspect of witcher professional lives, forcing them to navigate social environments where they remained perpetually outsiders, tolerated when useful yet never accepted as equals by populations whose prejudices their mutations inevitably triggered. The witches learned to function within these constraints, developing professional practices and personal philosophies that acknowledged realities of their positions while maintaining sufficient dignity to endure centuries of marginalization. The mutations that enhanced witches' combat capabilities simultaneously marked them as visibly non-human in ways that generated instinctive negative responses from populations encountering them. The cat-like eyes that reflected light and darkness, the pale or unusually toned skin that resulted from alchemical transformations, the distinctive hair colors some witches developed through specific mutagen combinations, all served as constant reminders that these hunters existed outside normal human categories. Children feared them instinctively, their appearance triggering primitive recognition that witches represented something fundamentally other despite superficial human resemblance. Adults who intellectually understood that witches served protective functions found themselves experiencing visceral discomfort when interacting with beings whose mutations violated expectations regarding human morphology. The professional structure witches developed attempted to establish clear boundaries and expectations that might mitigate social hostility through predictable interactions focused strictly on contractual obligations. The code that governed witcher behavior, though perhaps more informal tradition than literal rulebook, emphasized neutrality in human political conflicts, refusal to involve themselves in disputes between nobles or kingdoms, and strict limitation of their activities to hunting monsters rather than targeting humans regardless of provocations or financial incentives. This neutrality served practical purposes, as witches needed to maintain access to all regions and communities rather than becoming associated with particular factions whose enemies might refuse their services or actively work to eliminate them. The payment structures witches negotiated for their services reflected ongoing tensions between communities' needs for monster hunting capabilities and their reluctance to appropriately compensate providers they simultaneously required and resented. Witches typically demanded payment upfront or at minimum secured binding agreements before undertaking contracts, recognizing that clients frequently attempted to renegotiate terms after services had been rendered or simply refused payment once monster threats had been eliminated. The necessity of discussing compensation before beginning work generated accusations that witches cared only for coin rather than genuinely protecting communities, though witches correctly noted that they needed income for basic survival and that communities rarely volunteered fair compensation without explicit negotiation. The constant travel that defined witcher professional lives resulted from combination of practical necessity and social marginalization. Monster populations distributed unevenly across the continent meant that witches who remained in single locations would experience periods without available contracts, forcing them to travel continuously seeking work in regions currently experiencing particular threats. The social hostility they encountered in most communities meant that extended stays in any location proved uncomfortable even when work remained available, as populations tolerated witches while contracts justified their presence yet made clear through countless small acts of exclusion that permanent residents would never be welcome. Witches became perpetual wanderers, moving along established routes that took them through territories where their services might be needed, never settling, never truly belonging anywhere. The training of new witches presented ongoing challenges given the high mortality rates during trials and the limited numbers of schools capable of conducting transformations. The witcher schools developed various methods for obtaining candidates, with the law of surprise emerging as particularly important mechanism that provided moral if not strictly ethical justification for claiming children. Under this tradition, individuals saved by witches from mortal peril might invoke ancient custom offering as payment the first thing they encountered upon returning home that they did not expect to find. When this unexpected thing proved to be a child conceived but not yet born at the time of parents' rescue, the law of surprise entitled the witcher to claim that child for training once they reached appropriate age. This practice generated considerable controversy, as parents who had made such promises often changed their minds when actually required to surrender children, while witches argued that societies had no right to benefit from their services without providing candidates necessary for maintaining professional continuity. The relationships between witches and the human communities they nominally served remained perpetually strained by mutual distrust and incompatible expectations. Villages that summoned witches to address monster problems frequently withheld information or provided inaccurate descriptions of threats, either through genuine ignorance or deliberate deception motivated by various reasons. Witches approached contracts with professional skepticism, recognizing that claimed monster sightings sometimes reflected misidentification of natural phenomena, deliberate fabrications designed to eliminate human enemies through witcher action, or situations more complex than simple monster elimination. The investigative work necessary before implementing solutions consumed time that clients resented paying for, generating complaints that witches unnecessarily delayed action while extracting additional fees for services that should have been included in original agreements. The emotional mutations that accompanied physical enhancements contributed to witches' social isolation in ways extending beyond mere appearance. The dampening of effect that witches experienced made normal emotional responses difficult or impossible, creating barriers to forming meaningful relationships with non-mutants whose emotional lives remained intact. Witches described feeling as though they observed life through barriers that prevented full participation, recognizing intellectually that certain situations should generate particular emotional responses yet experiencing only muted echoes of what they understood normal humans would feel. This disconnect made casual social interactions challenging and deeper relationships nearly impossible, as potential friends or romantic partners eventually recognized that witches could not reciprocate emotional connections with appropriate intensity. The few lasting relationships witches formed typically involved other witches who shared similar experiences and understood the limitations their mutations imposed, or occasionally sorceresses whose own chaos-induced transformations created comparable emotional alterations. These relationships provided respite from constant isolation most witches endured, offering rare opportunities for genuine connection with individuals who understood without requiring explanation what existence as perpetual outsider entailed. The communities that sometimes formed when witches gathered at their school's headquarters during winter months, unable to travel due to weather conditions, provided annual opportunities for social interaction with others who shared their profession's unique burdens and challenges. The public perception of witches fluctuated based on immediate circumstances and propaganda from various sources with interests in shaping popular attitudes. During periods when monster attacks intensified, communities praised witches as essential protectors whose services justified whatever prices they demanded and whose mutations should be overlooked given crucial functions they performed. When monster threats diminished or witches became involved in controversies, whether through genuine misconduct or false accusations, public sentiment shifted toward viewing them as dangerous mutants whose continued existence posed threats potentially exceeding whatever benefits their hunting services provided. Witches learned to recognize these cycles, understanding that current appreciation could transform into hostility with minimal provocation and that permanent acceptance would never occur regardless of services rendered or professional conduct maintained. The decline that witcher populations experienced across later centuries resulted from multiple factors, including reduced monster numbers through their own successful hunting activities, loss of schools to various catastrophes, and society's decreasing willingness to support institutions that created beings viewed with such ambivalence. The witches who survived into later eras found themselves representing dying profession whose remaining members would likely perish without replacements given that transformation knowledge had been lost when schools fell and no political will existed for reconstructing institutions necessary for creating new enhanced hunters. These late-era witches continued their work with recognition that they represented final generation of their kind, walking roads that fewer travelers walked each year as monster populations continue declining and human societies learn to manage remaining threats through conventional means that required no dealing with mutants whose services came at prices both financial and social that populations increasingly deemed excessive compared to actual benefits received. The witches' existence as necessary outcasts, beings whose mutations granted capabilities communities required yet simultaneously marked them as fundamentally other in ways that prevented true social integration, represented perhaps the conjunction's most tragically ironic legacies. The children sacrificed to create enhanced hunters through brutal alchemical processes paid permanent prices for transformations they never chose, spending centuries or decades serving populations that accepted their labor while rejecting their humanity, dying eventually as lonely wanderers whose graves would receive no markers and whose names would fade from memory within generations, leaving only fragmentary records suggesting that once, in desperate times, humans had created monsters to fight monsters, then discarded the created ones when they proved no longer necessary for purposes their makers had imposed upon them without consent or compensation adequate to costs their service eternally demanded. The gradual displacement of elven populations from territories they had occupied for centuries before human arrival culminated in series of conflicts that would later be termed the Elven Wars, though this designation obscures the reality that events consisted less of formal warfare between organized states than progressive encroachment punctuated by violent resistance and brutal suppressions. The expansion of human kingdoms proceeded relentlessly despite elven attempts at diplomatic negotiation, military resistance, and appeals to shared interests that might have persuaded humans to respect boundaries or establish coexistence arrangements. The demographic realities that favored humanity, combined with human willingness to employ methods elves considered barbaric and human military doctrines optimized for conquest rather than defense, created conditions where elven defeat became inevitable regardless of individual battle outcomes or temporary truces that merely delayed rather than prevented ultimate desposis scion. The initial phases of human expansion into elven territories proceeded through gradual encroachment rather than declared campaigns of conquest. Human settlements established themselves in forest margins, clearing land for agriculture while claiming their respected deeper woodlands that elves considered sacred or essential to their way of life. These marginal settlements served as bases for further expansion, with each generation pushing boundaries deeper into territories that elves had not formally ceded but lacked military capacity to defend across all vulnerable frontiers. The pattern repeated across decades and centuries, with elves yielding ground incrementally until recognizing too late that they had been maneuvered into untenable positions where resistance would require resources they no longer possessed after years of accepting small losses to avoid immediate large conflicts. The elven military responses to human encroachment reflected assumptions and practices developed for different types of conflicts than conquest wars that humans waged. The elves favored defensive strategies that minimized casualties among their own limited populations, preferring to make human occupation costly enough that invaders might voluntarily withdraw rather than pursuing decisive victories that risked substantial elven losses. This approach proved catastrophically inadequate against human kingdoms willing to accept casualty rates that would devastate elven communities while merely inconveniencing human military operations supplied by populations that could replace losses within single generations. The elves' individual combat skills, superior to human average even before accounting for centuries of experience some elven warriors possessed, provided insufficient advantage when outnumbered by margins that increased steadily as human populations grew while elven numbers stagnated or declined. The establishment of human control over formerly elven territories proceeded through combination of military conquest and administrative integration that transformed political realities faster than cultural assimilation could occur. Human monarchs who claimed sovereignty over regions with substantial elven populations implemented policies ranging from attempted cultural integration to active suppression depending on local conditions and individual royal philosophies. The most pragmatic human rulers recognized that wholesale elimination or expulsion of elven populations would waste potential economic resources and generate unnecessary resistance, preferring to establish systems where elves accepted human political dominance while maintaining limited autonomy in cultural and communal affairs. Other monarchs pursued more aggressive assimilation or simple displacement, viewing elven presence as obstacle to full human control rather than potentially manageable minority population. The loss of elven independence in territories that became core regions of human kingdoms occurred gradually enough that no single moment marked definitive transition from elven sovereignty to human dominance. Individual elven communities found themselves increasingly subject to human laws, required to pay taxes to human authorities, and unable to rely upon elven political institutions that lacked enforcement power once surrounded by human-controlled territories. The surrender of elven cities to human sieges, the signing of treaties that acknowledged human suzerainty in exchange for limited autonomy, the gradual emigration of elves from regions where human dominance made traditional lives impossible, all contributed to transformation that left elven political independence confined to increasingly small refuges that existed on human sufferance rather than through elven capability to resist conquest should humans choose to complete their expansion. The refuge that would become Dol Blathana represented the most significant remaining territory where elven political authority persisted, though even this enclave existed within broader context of human dominance that shaped its status and limited its sovereignty. The establishment of Dol Blathana as recognized elven territory occurred through negotiations between elven leaders and human kingdoms that calculated allowing limited elven autonomy in remote regions served their interests better than continuing campaigns that consumed military resources while generating minimal economic returns. The arrangement satisfied neither party fully, with elves resenting dependence on human agreement for maintaining even truncated independence while humans remained suspicious that Dol Blathana might serve as base for future elven resistance or harbor populations who refused to accept human regional dominance. The Scoia'tael, whose name translated as squirrels in common speech, though the origin of this designation remained subject to various interpretations, emerged as militant resistance movements composed of elves and occasional members of other elder races who rejected accommodation with human dominance. These guerrilla fighters operated from wilderness regions, conducting raids against human settlements, ambushing military patrols, and occasionally perpetrating acts that human authorities characterized as terrorism while supporters viewed as legitimate resistance against occupation. The Scoia'tael represented diverse motivations and loose coordination rather than unified organization, with some bands fighting primarily to defend specific territories while others pursued broader objectives of restoring elven independence or at minimum extracting sufficient costs from human kingdoms that negotiated settlements might grant concessions unachievable through diplomatic means alone. The human responses to Scoia'tael resistance combined military operations intended to eliminate guerrilla bands with collective punishment directed against elven populations accused of harboring or supporting rebels. The villages that suffered human reprisals, whether or not their inhabitants had actually assisted Scoia'tael operations, provided grim demonstrations that resistance carried consequences extending beyond fighters themselves to encompass entire communities. The strategy aimed to isolate Scoia'tael from popular support by making collaboration more dangerous than cooperation with human authorities, though it simultaneously generated resentment that drove recruitment as elves concluded they had nothing to lose through resistance given that human retaliation appeared independent of actual guilt or collaboration. The gradual reduction of elven populations through combination of conflict casualties, emigration to remaining autonomous territories, and cultural assimilation of individuals or families who integrated into human societies transformed demographics across regions that had supported substantial elven communities before human expansion. The elves who remained in human-dominated territories generally occupied subordinate social positions, facing legal restrictions on property ownership, professional activities, and political participation that codified their minority status. The economic niches available to elves in human societies concentrated in activities that humans valued yet preferred not to perform themselves, or specializations where elven longevity and traditional knowledge provided advantages that overcame human prejudices sufficiently to permit profitable operations. The dwarven populations weathered human expansion more successfully than elves through combination of geographic concentration in territories humans valued less intensely and economic specializations that made dwarven communities valuable trading partners rather than competitors for resources. The mountain holds that dwarfs preferred for settlement held limited attraction for human agricultural expansion, and dwarven expertise in mining, metallurgy, and gem-cutting produced goods that human kingdoms eagerly purchased. Individual dwarfs integrated into human communities with relative ease despite physical differences and cultural distinctiveness, finding employment as craftspeople, engineers, and merchants in roles where their skills commanded respect that partially offset prejudices their non-human status inspired. The accommodations dwarfs achieved preserved substantial cultural autonomy and economic prosperity even within broader context of human political dominance. The halfling communities survived through similar strategies of occupying economic niches that humans valued while avoiding direct competition for political power or territorial control. The halflings' agricultural expertise and contentment with modest holdings meant they posed no threat to human expansion while providing valuable services that made them economically useful members of communities otherwise dominated by human populations. The halflings' generally peaceful dispositions and physical characteristics that made them seem less threatening than larger elder races contributed to relatively favorable treatment compared to elves whose pride and martial traditions generated ongoing conflicts even after human numerical and military superiority had rendered elven independence ultimately unsustainable. The transformation that occurred across mere centuries, seeing elven populations displaced from territories they had occupied for ages before human arrival and reduced to marginalized minorities in lands that had once belonged to them without question, represented among the most consequential long-term effects of the conjunction of the spheres beyond the immediate catastrophe of dimensional collapse. The humans who had arrived as refugees from dying worlds, primitive and powerless compared to established elder race civilizations, had through reproductive advantages and adaptive capacity achieved dominance that would define the continent's political and cultural landscape across all subsequent centuries, creating kingdoms and institutions that would endure long after the circumstances enabling human ascension had faded from living memory into history that most inhabitants understood only imperfectly if they contemplated it at all. The emergence of organized magical institutions transformed chaos manipulation from scattered individual practitioners into coordinated systems capable of exerting substantial political influence across the northern kingdoms. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, established approximately 839 years after the conjunction of the spheres according to commonly accepted chronologies, represented the first successful attempt to unite magic users under collective governance structures that regulated practice while simultaneously asserting mags' rights to operate with substantial autonomy from secular authorities. The Brotherhood's formation reflected recognition that individual practitioners working in isolation remained vulnerable to persecution or manipulation by monarchs who viewed and sanctioned magic users as threats, while collective organization provided sufficient power to negotiate terms ensuring mags' independence and security. The laws of magic drafted by the Brotherhood's founding members established frameworks defining appropriate use of chaos powers, limitations on applications considered excessively dangerous or ethically problematic, and procedures for addressing violations. These regulations represented attempts to forestall external regulation by demonstrating that mags could police themselves according to principles balancing freedom of magical practice against societal concerns about unconstrained power. The laws prohibited certain applications including widespread mental manipulation of populations, deliberate creation of monsters through biological experimentation, and use of magic to fundamentally alter weather patterns or geological structures on scales that might generate cascading environmental disasters. The enforcement mechanisms remained deliberately vague, relying primarily on peer pressure and threat of collective action against violators rather than formal courts or systematic investigations. The Brotherhood's organizational structure reflected compromises between competing priorities including collective governance, individual autonomy, and practical necessity of maintaining hierarchy sufficient for coordinating activities across geographically dispersed membership. The Chapter of Wizards emerged as highest governance body, consisting of senior practitioners who gathered periodically to address major policy questions and adjudicate disputes that could not be resolved through informal channels. Individual members maintained substantial independence in daily activities, accepting Brotherhood authority primarily regarding matters affecting the collective while retaining freedom to pursue personal interests and accept employment according to individual judgment. This balance satisfied most practitioners while generating periodic conflicts when collective interests appeared to conflict with individual autonomy. The establishment of magical academies including Aretusa on Tanad Island created institutional frameworks for systematic training replacing informal apprenticeship systems that had previously dominated magical education. Aretusa, founded by Clara Larissa de Winter, developed reputation as premier institution for training sorceresses, implementing rigorous selection processes that accepted only candidates demonstrating exceptional potential while subjecting them to educational regimens that eliminated substantial percentages before graduation. The training emphasized not merely technical magical capabilities but also political sophistication, recognizing that mags who advised monarchs needed skills extending beyond chaos manipulation to include diplomacy, strategic analysis, and ability to navigate court intrigues where missteps could prove fatal regardless of magical prowess. The Parallel Academy at Ban Odd served similar functions for male practitioners, though institutional cultures differed in ways reflecting broader societal attitudes regarding appropriate behaviors and capabilities for different genders. The segregation of magical training by sex generated ongoing debates regarding whether combined instruction might produce superior results through encouraging cooperation and mutual learning, or whether separate institutions better served students' needs given distinct challenges male and female practitioners faced in broader society. The practical result maintained institutional separation while facilitating informal exchanges, allowing particularly promising students to receive instruction from masters at both academies regardless of official enrollment. The political influence mags accumulated through serving as royal advisors transformed them into powers whose capabilities and interests required consideration alongside traditional military and economic factors when monarchs made strategic decisions. The kingdoms that secured services from particularly capable or influential mags gained advantages in both international diplomacy and internal governance, as magical capabilities provided intelligence gathering, communications, and occasionally direct military applications that opponents lacking equivalent magical support could not counter. The competition among kingdoms for most talented practitioners drove compensation to levels that made successful mags extraordinarily wealthy, accumulating resources that funded research, maintained impressive residences, and generally supported lifestyles rivaling minor nobility. The emergence of the Lodge of Sorceresses as hidden organization operating parallel to and occasionally in opposition to the formal brotherhood represented recognition among female practitioners that official structures inadequately addressed their specific interests and concerns. The lodge functioned through informal networks rather than declared membership or formal governance, allowing sorceresses to coordinate activities and advance shared objectives without creating visible targets for opponents who might attempt to suppress female magical cooperation. The lodge's influence extended across kingdoms through members occupying advisory positions that provided access to crucial information and opportunities to shape policy decisions, creating informal power structure whose existence remained known primarily to participants and occasional perceptive observers who recognized coordination patterns suggesting organized cooperation beyond what chance would produce. The relationship between the Brotherhood and secular authorities remained perpetually tense, characterized by mutual dependence that prevented either side from entirely subordinating the other while generating ongoing conflicts over boundaries and appropriate spheres of influence. Monarchs required magical services for various purposes yet resented mags' independence and their tendency to pursue objectives not always aligned with royal interests. The mags needed political stability and access to resources that only functioning kingdoms could provide, yet refused subordination to secular authority that might compromise their ability to make independent judgments or limit their freedom to accept or decline particular employments. The resulting arrangements reflected pragmatic accommodations rather than principled agreements, with specific terms negotiated individually between kingdoms and practitioners according to local circumstances and personalities involved. The magical academies' selective admission policies and brutal training regimens that eliminated substantial percentages of candidates created perpetual shortages of qualified practitioners relative to demand, driving compensation to levels that ensured successful mags commanded extraordinary wealth and status. The academies justified high attrition through arguing that chaos manipulation required capabilities only rare individuals possessed, with inadequate practitioners representing dangers to themselves and others if permitted to practice without demonstrated mastery. Critics suggested artificial scarcity served economic interests of established practitioners who benefited from limited competition, though defenders noted genuine dangers associated with inadequately trained magic users whose failed workings could generate catastrophic side effects. The accumulation of magical knowledge across generations transformed chaos manipulation from desperate improvisation by early experimenters into sophisticated discipline with substantial theoretical foundations and documented best practices. The libraries maintained by academies and individual practitioners preserved research regarding optimal techniques for various applications, catalogues of known dangers and side effects, and theoretical frameworks attempting to explain underlying principles governing how chaos manipulation operated. This accumulated knowledge represented valuable resource that academies guarded carefully, restricting access to proven practitioners while preventing dissemination to outside populations who might attempt dangerous applications without proper training or supervision. The social positions mags occupied remained ambiguous despite their political influence and economic success, as mutations marking experienced practitioners as visibly different generated ongoing prejudices similar to those affecting witches, though typically less severe given that mags' appearances remained more subtly altered. The sterility afflicting most sorceresses represented particularly painful cost, creating situations where women who had achieved extraordinary power and influence found themselves unable to bear children regardless of desires or dynastic considerations. The emotional mutations accumulating through chaos exposure contributed to perceptions of mags as cold and calculating, reinforcing stereotypes that practitioners cared only for power and knowledge while remaining indifferent to ordinary human concerns or ethical constraints. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers and associated institutions transformed magical practice from marginal activity pursued by scattered individuals into organized system capable of exerting substantial influence over political, economic, and military affairs across the northern kingdoms. The mags who emerged from this system possessed capabilities and resources that made them among the most powerful individuals in their world, yet remained fundamentally marked by chaos exposure in ways that prevented true social integration regardless of status and wealth they accumulated, creating populations of enhanced humans who existed at margins of societies they ostensibly served while pursuing agendas not always aligned with stated objectives of protecting civilization or advancing general welfare, instead frequently prioritizing personal interests or abstract principles over practical concerns of populations whose lives remained subject to consequences of decisions made by beings who had transformed themselves through wielding forces that cared nothing for human values or limitations. Among the countless genetic lineages that traced descent through generations of human and elven populations, one bloodline carried within its chromosomes capabilities that transcended normal hereditary traits, manifesting in powers that echoed abilities lost when the conjunction of the spheres severed elven world-walking capabilities, and restructured dimensional boundaries across the multiverse. The Elder Blood, known in Elder speech as Henneker, represented genetic legacy originating with Lara Doran Ape Shiardal, an elven sorceress of extraordinary power whose union with a human mage named Crigenin of Lod produced a child carrying unique magical potential that would propagate through subsequent generations in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than random genetic inheritance. Lara Doran's capabilities exceeded those of typical elven practitioners, demonstrating mastery of chaos manipulation that rivaled the most accomplished human mags, despite elves generally relying on their innate racial magic rather than learned chaos techniques. Her research apparently focused on understanding dimensional structures and exploring possibilities for restoring elven world-walking abilities lost during the conjunction, seeking methods that might allow traversing boundaries between spheres without requiring the innate talents that mutations during the conjunction had permanently eliminated. The theoretical frameworks she developed and the experimental techniques she employed apparently produced genetic modifications that became hereditary, passing to her daughter and subsequently through maternal lines across generations that followed. The union between Lara Doran and Crigenin of Lod represented transgression of social boundaries that both elven and human societies condemned, though for different reasons reflecting distinct prejudices and concerns. The elves viewed relationships with humans as degradation of their bloodlines, introducing genetic material from species they considered inherently inferior despite humans having demonstrated capabilities in certain domains that matched or exceeded elven achievements. Human communities viewed such unions with suspicion grounded in xenophobia and concerns that half-elven offspring might possess advantages that threatened human dominance or loyalties divided between species whose interests frequently conflicted. The tragic circumstances surrounding Lara Doran's demise and her daughter's survival became subjects of legend that obscured historical details while preserving cultural memory that something significant had occurred. The Elder Blood manifested in descendants as genetic predisposition toward exceptional magical capabilities extending beyond normal chaos manipulation into domains involving dimensional perception and limited reality alteration. Individuals carrying active Elder Blood genes demonstrated abilities to sense dimensional boundaries, perceive multiple possible futures through accessing temporal streams, and in rare cases traverse between worlds through methods that echoed pre-conjunction elven world-walking, though operating through different mechanisms. The genetic basis for these capabilities remained mysterious even to mags who studied hereditary magical traits, as the relevant genes apparently functioned through principles that transcended normal biological processes and involved mystical dimensions that conventional genetic analysis could not adequately explain. The Elder Blood passed through maternal lines with patterns suggesting it required specific genetic combinations to manifest active capabilities rather than simply being present in recessive forms. Many descendants carried the genes without expressing extraordinary abilities, living ordinary lives while unknowingly transmitting potential that might manifest in later generations when appropriate genetic circumstances aligned. The individuals in whom Elder Blood activated fully demonstrated powers from early ages, exhibiting spontaneous magical effects that occurred without training or conscious control, creating dangerous situations when untrained children inadvertently manipulated forces they could neither understand nor reliably direct. The prophecies surrounding the Elder Blood, attributed to the elven seer Ithlin, described a child descended from Lara Doran who would possess powers exceeding all previous carriers, capable of altering reality on scales that might reshape civilizations or destroy worlds depending on how abilities manifested and choices the individual made. The prophecies remained subject to varied interpretations, with some scholars viewing them as metaphorical warnings about dangers inherent in unconstrained power, while others treated them as literal predictions requiring intervention to either ensure fulfillment in beneficial directions or prevent catastrophic outcomes through eliminating the prophesied child before abilities could fully develop. The political implications of Elder Blood genetics generated intense interest among powers seeking advantages through controlling or eliminating individuals carrying this hereditary trait. The kingdoms that might claim sovereignty over Elder Blood carriers faced strategic decisions regarding whether such individuals represented valuable resources whose capabilities might be harnessed for national interests or existential threats whose powers exceeded safe limits regardless of professed loyalties or intentions. The mags who studied Elder Blood sought to understand mechanisms underlying its extraordinary capabilities, hoping to replicate effects through alternative means that might make dimensional manipulation accessible to practitioners lacking genetic predispositions. The elves' interest in elder blood genetics reflected their recognition that these genes represented potential solution to problems that had confined them to dying worlds since the conjunction eliminated traditional world walking. The dimensional travel capabilities elder blood carriers demonstrated, however limited compared to pre-conjunction elven abilities, suggested genetic material that might be integrated into elf populations through selective breeding programs. The Wild Hunt, spectral riders who appeared periodically to abduct individuals possessing elder blood or related genetic traits, served objectives of obtaining genetic resources necessary for restoring their species' lost capabilities through biological rather than mystical means. The ethical questions surrounding elder blood carriers' treatment generated debates among those who recognized moral problems inherent in viewing individuals primarily as genetic resources to be controlled, studied, or eliminated according to others' interests. The carriers themselves, born with capabilities they never chose and frequently struggled to control, found their lives shaped by forces beyond their influence as various powers competed to determine their fates. The children who manifested elder blood abilities faced futures constrained by prophecies they had no hand in creating and political calculations that treated them as pieces in games whose rules they did not establish and whose outcomes would determine not merely their personal destinies but potentially the fates of populations across multiple dimensions. The training necessary for elder blood carriers to safely control their capabilities required expertise that few practitioners possessed, as conventional magical education addressed learned chaos manipulation rather than innate dimensional powers operating through different principles. The carriers who received inadequate training risked catastrophic accidents when unconsciously triggered abilities manifested in uncontrolled forms, potentially creating dimensional rifts, temporal anomalies, or reality distortions that endangered everyone in proximity. The emotional stress that untrained carriers experienced when confronting abilities they could neither fully understand nor reliably suppress contributed to psychological trauma that complicated efforts to provide effective instruction even when qualified teachers became available. The question of whether elder blood represented blessing or curse admitted no simple answer, varying according to perspectives and circumstances of individuals discussing the matter. The carriers who successfully mastered their abilities gained powers that placed them among the most capable individuals in any sphere they inhabited, commanding capabilities that exceeded what even exceptional conventional mags could achieve. Those who failed to develop adequate control or fell victim to powers seeking to exploit their genetics experienced lives defined by others' agendas, reduced to resources whose value derived from hereditary traits rather than personal qualities or choices. The elder blood thus represented simultaneously extraordinary gift and terrible burden. Legacy of elven sorceress whose love across species boundaries had created genetic miracle that would influence events across centuries and potentially reshape destinies of multiple worlds should prophecies prove accurate, and the child of elder blood described in Ithlin's visions eventually emerged to fulfill or subvert predictions that had cast shadows across generations waiting for their ultimate subject. To be born and face choices that might determine whether dimensional boundaries that had stabilized after the conjunction remained intact or shattered once again in new cataclysm, whose consequences none could predict with certainty. The dimensional boundaries that had restabilized following the conjunction of the spheres, settling into configurations that prevented the chaotic interpenetration of worlds that had characterized the initial catastrophe, nevertheless remained fundamentally different from structures that had existed before that cosmic event. The multiverse continued existing as a collection of interconnected spheres whose separations, while substantially more stable than during the conjunction itself, maintained permeability under certain conditions that allowed limited passage between dimensions for those possessing appropriate capabilities or accessing specific locations where boundaries remained thinner than elsewhere. This residual interconnection meant that the conjunction represented not simply historical catastrophe whose effects had been absorbed and overcome, but rather permanent transformation of reality's fundamental structure whose implications extended far beyond immediate consequences of monster arrivals and human refuges. The possibility of another conjunction, whether limited in scope or approaching the scale of the original dimensional collapse, remained subject of ongoing concern among those who understood cosmic mechanics sufficiently to recognize warning signs. The scholars who studied dimensional theory identified patterns suggesting that boundaries underwent periodic stress cycles that might, under certain circumstances, produce localized conjunctions affecting specific regions rather than global catastrophes. The concentration of chaos energy in particular locations created zones where dimensional fabric maintained inherent instability, making these sites vulnerable to breaches that might allow creatures or individuals to cross between spheres even when broader boundaries remained intact. The monitoring of these vulnerable sites occupied resources from various institutions concerned about potential consequences of uncontrolled dimensional passages. The individuals who possessed elder blood capabilities demonstrated that dimensional travel remained possible for those with appropriate genetic predispositions and sufficient training to control innate abilities. These carriers could perceive dimensional boundaries as structures possessing texture and permeability rather than absolute barriers, allowing them to identify locations where crossing between spheres might be accomplished through techniques that normal humans or even skilled mags lacking elder blood could not replicate. The existence of these capabilities suggested that pre-conjunction elven world walking had not been permanently eliminated, but rather transformed into hereditary trait concentrated in specific bloodlines, whose genetics preserved fragments of abilities that had once been racial characteristics shared among all elves. The Wild Hunt represented manifestation of ENL attempts to create limited dimensional passages that allowed brief incursions into other spheres for purposes of acquiring resources or individuals possessing genetic traits they required. The spectral riders who appeared during these manifestations demonstrated that the ENL had developed methods for partially bypassing dimensional barriers through techniques that apparently involved substantial preparation and could be maintained only temporarily before natural tendencies of boundaries to reassert themselves forced return to their native sphere. The appearances of the Wild Hunt created localized instabilities that occasionally allowed other entities to cross between dimensions, generating minor conjunctions whose scales remained manageable yet demonstrated that complete dimensional isolation had not been restored. The prophecies regarding elder blood carriers included warnings that individuals possessing fully activated capabilities might inadvertently or deliberately trigger conjunctions through improper use of dimensional manipulation powers. The visions attributed to Ithlin described possibilities where attempts to traverse between worlds generated cascading failures in dimensional boundaries, producing chain reactions that spread across multiple spheres and potentially replicated or exceeded the original conjunction's catastrophic scope. These prophecies motivated both attempts to eliminate elder blood carriers before their powers could fully manifest and alternative approaches focused on ensuring such individuals received training sufficient to prevent catastrophic accidents while channeling capabilities toward beneficial applications. The artifacts that had been created before or during the conjunction, objects imbued with powers that transcended normal magical items through incorporating dimensional energies or materials from multiple spheres, occasionally demonstrated unexpected activations that suggested residual connections to forces involved in the original catastrophe. The scholars who studied these objects recognized that they represented both valuable sources of knowledge regarding pre-conjunction capabilities and potential hazards that might trigger unintended effects, including localized dimensional rifts. The question of whether such artifacts should be preserved for study or destroyed to eliminate risks they pose generated ongoing debates among those with authority over particularly significant examples. The theoretical frameworks that mags developed for understanding dimensional mechanics suggested that while spontaneous repetition of the original conjunction remained unlikely absent specific triggering events, the possibility could not be dismissed entirely. The calculations indicated that dimensional boundaries maintained dynamic equilibrium requiring constant subtle adjustments to accommodate stresses generated by various natural and artificial processes. The accumulation of disruptions over extended periods might theoretically produce conditions where boundaries could fail catastrophically if critical thresholds were exceeded. The monitoring systems that certain institutions maintained attempted to track indicators that might provide warning if such critical conditions approached. The locations where rifts had opened during the original conjunction sometimes demonstrated persistent anomalies suggesting that dimensional fabric in these regions had never fully healed. These sites attracted interest from researchers seeking to understand conjunction mechanics while simultaneously generating concerns that they represented vulnerable points where future breaches might occur most easily. The question of whether these locations should be sealed through magical interventions, left alone to avoid triggering unintended consequences, or actively studied to maximize understanding regardless of risks, reflected broader tensions between caution and pursuit of knowledge that characterized many debates regarding dimensional phenomena. The elves' ongoing imprisonment in their dying world created desperation that might eventually drive them toward increasingly risky attempts at creating dimensional passages sufficient for mass evacuation. The recognition that their species faced extinction if they could not escape the White Frost's advance motivated exploration of options that they might otherwise reject as excessively dangerous. The possibility that Enel desperation might lead to actions triggering broader dimensional instabilities created scenarios where attempts to solve one species' existential crisis could generate catastrophes affecting multiple worlds whose inhabitants had no involvement in decisions producing consequences they would be forced to endure. The unicorns, whose understanding of dimensional mechanics exceeded all other species' knowledge, maintained their distance from populations whose previous demands for assistance had contributed to the original conjunction. The limited interactions that occurred between unicorns and other intelligent species suggested that these beings remained deeply concerned about ongoing dimensional instabilities and actively worked to maintain boundaries through methods that other species could neither perceive nor assist. The question of whether unicorns might intervene to prevent future conjunctions or whether they had concluded that such interventions carried risks exceeding potential benefits remained unanswerable given their unwillingness to communicate regarding their activities or intentions. The recognition that dimensional boundaries might fail again under certain circumstances transformed the conjunction from purely historical event into ongoing threat requiring perpetual vigilance and careful management of activities that might stress already fragile structures. The populations who understood these realities lived with awareness that the world's apparent stability represented temporary condition that could dissolve under circumstances that might emerge without warning or might be triggered by actions of individuals pursuing objectives with no consideration for cosmic consequences. The conjunction of the spheres thus remained present not merely as historical catastrophe whose effects continued shaping civilization, but as future possibility whose potential recurrence cast shadows across all planning and decisions involving dimensional phenomena, creating tensions between those who believed appropriate caution required restricting all activities that might risk triggering new catastrophes and others who argued that progress required accepting measured risks while implementing safeguards intended to prevent worst outcomes from manifesting regardless of whether such safeguards would prove adequate if conditions ever deteriorated toward levels approaching the original conjunction's chaotic dimensional interpenetration.